Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Arnett. I am the IP Law Fellow here at the Center for Intellectual Property Information and Privacy Law at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Law. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Gary Friedlander. Gary is, if he turns his camera and microphone on, he can actually join the stage himself instead of me having to invite him up. But Mr. Friedlander is an advisory board member of the IP Center and a soon-to-be former senior vice president and deputy general counsel at TransUnion. But importantly for us, he was recently announced as the interim director designate, and he will become the director of the IP Center effective July 1st. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Mr. Friedlander for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Adam. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 13th Annual Ethics and the Practice of IP Law Seminar. I would like to first recognize and thank Center Director Darrell Lim for his years of service to UIC Law as a professor, a legal scholar, and director of the Center for IP Information and Privacy Law. As Darrell leaves UIC Law, he does so leaving a legacy benefiting students and practitioners, past, present, and future. Darrell's leadership and contributions established the school's IP program as one which is nationally recognized and highly ranked. I want to also recognize and thank UIC IP Law Fellow Adam Arnett and his immediate predecessor, Kyle Cirilla, for their leadership in putting together this seminar tackling these topics of utmost importance: mental health and diversity, equity, and inclusion. If the need to pay heed to the importance of mental health was not recognized before the pandemic, it certainly has become recognized now, and more importantly has led to law firms and companies alike increasing the resources available to their employees. Seeking treatment, whether through psychiatry or psychology or a combination of both, is losing the stigma once attached to it, and it is about time. While working from home has become the norm, the stresses of working in high-pressure professions such as law have not diminished, and ever more so with the computer always in front of you or a few steps away, and the expectations of being on call 24/7. All the more so when starting out and trying to make a name for yourself. But it doesn't need to be this way if you don't want it to be. As in all things in life, balance is required. For every action, there is or will be an equal and opposite reaction. Something always has to give. Diversity programs are intended to ensure the representation of different groups of individuals within an organization, whether differences are ages, races, ethnicities, abilities, disabilities, social economic backgrounds, cultures, or sexual orientations. Equity programs are aimed at ensuring fair treatment and equality of opportunity, advancement, and pay. Equity programs are intended to remove barriers, ensure fairness and impartiality. But it's not enough to just focus on diversity and equity. Organizations must also ensure there is an inclusive culture where everyone is welcome, actively ensuring everyone has an opportunity to contribute and participate. Inclusion embraces diversity and puts equity into real action. In an inclusive environment, individuals feel respected and supportive. Without an inclusive environment, an organization's DE&I program will ultimately fail to bring the benefits of a diverse and equitable workforce to the organization. And more importantly, will fail to advance the changes we need to bring about as a society. DE&I cannot be imposed. It must be fostered. It must be embraced. DE&I cannot be just numbers to post on websites or demonstrated at the executive board levels. It must permeate an organization. DE&I is a program with no end date. I now have the privilege of turning the program over to Adam. To the panelists, thank you for participating. To the audience, thank you again for attending, and I hope you too will participate in these important discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Friedlander. We'll now be moving to session 1, mental health and wellness, which you get to stay with me as I'll be your moderator. I would like to invite up to the stage our speakers, and I'll introduce them as they come up to the stage. So first we have Ms. Rachel Carnaggio. Ms. Carnaggio is a partner at Holland & Hart, LLP, where she advises clients on patent matters in a variety of industries, including biotechnology, pharmaceutical, environmental, cannabis, medical device, and digital health. We also have Ms. Rachel Honeycutt, an attorney advisor at FDA Regulatory Law Group of the Office of the Staff Judge Advocate General, U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command, where she advises her clients on regulatory and acquisition strategy for the development of life cycle of drugs, biologics, and medical devices to treat unique medical needs of the U.S. Army. We also have Mr. Kenny Matuszewski. Mr. Matuszewski is an associate at Goldberg Segalla, where he focuses his practice on complex, high-value IP litigation with a background in subject matters such as life sciences, software, electrical, and mechanical technologies. We also have Dr. Ruta Sansgiri. Dr. Sansgiri is currently Senior Director of Patents at Eli Lilly & Co. And prior to that, she was shareholder at a Denver-based IP law firm called Sheridan Ross. And finally, we have Ms. Dotto Skinner. Ms. Skinner is an associate at Perky & Barber, PLLC, where she practices in global trademark prosecution and enforcement. She is also an expat, but physically located in Portugal. So thanks for joining us from overseas. And please join me in welcoming the panel for session 1. With that, so of course, and I apologize in advance to my panelists. I'm changing the order up a little bit because I realized that it would sort of be it'd be a little difficult to move forward with the discussion on mental health without first discussing what mental health and wellness sort of actually meant to us, right? So the first question I want to sort of throw out there is, what are we talking about when we're talking about mental health in the IP field, in the legal profession, and what does it mean to each of us here today? So I think let's start with Rachel Carnaggio, since she's one of the unmuted people.
Okay. Well, to me, mental health in the IP field is directly related to stress. And that's because that's what I think we see most often as attorneys, and everything stems from that stress. This is a difficult profession. It's very taxing. And this was an issue even before COVID. So learning how to balance work life, that can be really stressful. And so when you say mental health, I think stress management.
Yeah, and
Rita, go ahead.
I'll chime in with Rachel, and I think you're exactly right. Mental stress this is a stressful profession, regardless of pandemic or not. And I think part of the reason is because as attorneys, legal profession is stressful because we have to look at what information is available today, and we have to assess risks that are going to come, 10 or 20 years later, like especially in patent law. You're filing your provisional applications on the information that's given to you today, but that patent has a 20-year life, and it's typically going to get in pharma and in biotech, it's going to get litigated at the end of its 20 years. So you are looking at this long timeline and trying to think of what could go wrong sitting today. And so I think it is a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainty, because laws change meanwhile too. So you're just like trying to predict what's coming down the line and advising, business decisions and guiding them. So it is certainly a stressful profession, and I think it goes into our non-legal life as well, because we become these creatures who are constantly thinking about what could go wrong and what are slow down everybody, wait, this could go wrong, right? And I think that adds to that overall feeling of mental stress.
Yeah, I'll jump in after. Sorry, are you hearing an echo too? Okay, then it's just on my end, so I'll keep talking. So to follow on what Ruta was saying, I think also it's the pressure of, perfection that we put on ourselves, that, when you're a junior associate and the, senior associates, partners, everyone has that feeling that you need to always be perfect, that mistake can never happen. And what's hard is when you're a junior associate, that's kind of how you learn, like you learn by doing something, having that constructive criticism. And I think that's kind of like the, dichotomy of it is that, how can you advance in the career and learn when you're also afraid to make mistakes and, have that feedback. And, that carries over a lot too, is, like the on-call, the 24/7, the expectation of perfection.
Just to jump in real quick, towards the end of that, I did hear a little bit of an echo, Rachel. But
Right.
with that said, I know, so not to move on from this question too early, but I know, Kenny, you actually have a lot to say about the various pressures that associates might feel to be perfect all the time. So in sort of answering the first question of, what are we talking about when we're talking about mental health, could you also sort of give some insight into those sorts of, those pressures as well?
Sure. So thanks so much, Adam. Well, what a question to start things off. But, definitely, it's interesting to think about because so many of my panelists spoke about this, like, pressure with, like, say, being perfect. But let's even think about, okay, the majority of people who are lawyers, especially IP lawyers, for the most of us, like, we did pretty well in school, like, from preschool all the way up. But maybe we hit a couple stumbling blocks in undergrad with like some difficult courses, but pretty much up through college, law school. Most of us did very well in school, maybe didn't. We're pretty much like, oh, well, you succeeded all the time to frankly have gotten to this point, like where you're at. So some of these things, probably for the very first time, people may be failing or maybe getting like negative criticisms of that work. But there's also, from what I've known, at least with current associates and probably particularly among younger people today, is that there's a big sense of uncertainty with now recessions looming. Say, for example, there's job security is always a big thing, which feeds into that. You don't want to be, people probably feel like, oh, I need to work or I have to be perfect because I need to keep this job because I have student loan payments or I maybe have a mortgage, maybe I have kids. The stakes are really high, potentially, if you fail. Like people may have to move for some of these jobs where people maybe went to law school in one area, or maybe they came from home, maybe they're working in a new environment. So where, say, for example, maybe you're from like a different town, maybe you moved to Chicago, maybe you moved to New York for work. And if you're working a lot, you don't really have that many close friends and connections. You don't have anybody to really kind of unplug with or talk with. Especially if your parents or like if nobody else in your family is like really a lawyer, like they're not going to get it necessarily, like some of these things. Like you can always talk with them about it, but it's something where it's a unique type of environment that can be high pressure, substantively. Can feel like drinking water out of a fire hose a lot, just even trying to get up to speed with like even knowing the practice area, while somehow trying to be perfect, while balancing the fact that maybe you have friends and family far away, that there's a lot on your shoulders now probably, and especially as we've seen over the past couple of years, there's a lot going on in the world and people have been impacted by that. And that's just layers upon little layers. And that all like comes with you to the office, like whether or not you're even aware of it. So that's at least some of the things that can at least impact it. Some things just to kind of think about, at least going forward.
Thank you, Kenny. And so, Dado, what do you think about this? What are we talking about when we're talking about mental health? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think when we talk about mental health, we're thinking about how to balance the stresses that come with our chosen careers and pursuing those careers, and also balancing work or balancing home life and balancing having, personal interests and balancing being a well-rounded individual. And so I think mental health is about finding a balance between all of those things and being able to, being able to pursue what it is that you love and pursue your vocation, but also feel like a full human at the same time.
Adam, there's one thing I just want to add super quickly. I ultimately feel like, especially for lawyers, it's about control. Your mental health so much, I think, depends upon like, I'm in control with my life. I have an understanding what I want to do, like where I want to be, just because that's something, if you feel like if you're a student coming out of school and you don't have a job and that pressure kind of mounts, and as more time comes, I don't have control. I don't have an income. I don't know how I'm going to live, how I'm going to eat food. Some people may think, oh, well, maybe there's a bad family situation, or I feel trapped at work and I don't know a way out or something. A lot of this just because, especially when we're expected to be giving advice and kind of driving the wheel, yet maybe sometimes we don't feel we have control over our own lives. I think finding a way, like having good mental health, is, again, accepting that there are certain things we can control, like what we can do, maybe what we can't control or keep up, and kind of finding the balance and tension with it, and recognizing that tension at times.
Well, thank you both for that. Yeah, it seems like even in Gary's opening remarks, one of the themes was balance, and a lot of you have touched on that theme even just now. And to the audience, there was no communication between Gary and this panel, believe it or not. So this is completely coincidence, and maybe for the best. But I wanted to talk about that balance aspect, right? And Dotto, I'd like to start with you, because a lot of us have been working remotely, and many of us are now feeling a little bit of a push to get back into the office, at least a little bit. But like I said in my introductions, Dotto is very remote, being in another country, even from where she's where the firm she's working with is affiliated or is located. And so we can get to the getting back into the office thing in a little bit, but I want to talk about how obviously COVID has affected how our work has permeated our personal life, right? How even we're always expected to be on 24/7, but how it's even more true because now we've shown our employers that we can be accessible wherever, whenever, for whatever reason, because we needed to be outside of the office. So I want to explore this idea of balance, this work life, home work balance, however you want to call it. And Dotto, could you sort of discuss, I guess, your experiences, the ups, the downs, the hardships, the obstacles you face necessarily with drawing those boundaries, right? With setting those boundaries and working through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my current position right now as an associate at Perky Barber, I am completely remote from Portugal. I live in Estoril, which is a city like 20 minutes outside of Lisbon. And I was hired on a part-time basis. So I don't work full-time, which definitely helps to create boundaries in my work and home life balance. And I also am very flexible in terms of like my hours. So I work when I'm able to work. I also have a 1-year-old daughter who I'm a primary caretaker for. So when I was hired, I kind of made that known to Perky Barber that those are priorities in my life, being able to be a present mother for my daughter at this stage in her life and in my life, and being able to kind of have like an easy transition back into working after pregnancy and childbirth. And so that was kind of the focus when I was hired, and setting that stage in terms of coming on as a new attorney, I think really helped to set out, what I was comfortable with. And it was a very different situation than I was in previously, which was working as a full-time associate at a big firm in Denver. And so I think being able to advocate for yourself and know what it is that you want, and know what it is that will make you feel full and whole as an individual, but also as a practitioner. And I think I just went into my new work experience with that in mind. And I've really been able to carve out a situation for myself that is perfect for this time and place where I am in life. And things might change as my daughter gets older and she starts to go to school. I think, working more and increasing my hours, it'll flow naturally in life. But I think just being understanding of where you are and what your needs are on a personal level and doing the best you can to advocate for that. But also, of course, there's so many things to consider in terms of, like a family dynamic and, financial need of your family and whatnot. But if you can try to find a balance with all of that and, prioritize what it is that's important to you, I would say that is the best way to kind of, strike that balance. And that's what I've been able to do personally.
Thank you, Dada. And now let's work backwards, right, from where we were. So Kenny, could you provide input as well as far as how maybe the pandemic and being remote has sort of has it changed expectations for you, I guess would be the question. And then two, how are you successfully or unsuccessfully, however you want to call it, setting those boundaries?
Well, it's actually a good question. And one thing I found that over the past couple of years is that whether it's remote or being hybrid, so say, for example, my current situation. So right now I'm in a hotel room. I'm in a different state for a conference. And here I am yet all talking to you at the same time. Like 2-3 years ago, I would have had to make a choice. Do I go to this conference or can I speak on this panel? In many ways, the beauty a lot of hybrid and remote work is that what used to be a lot of difficult choices. Should I relocate for that job? Like, is this an opportunity that I want to give up, like, my roots for? Like, I grew up in Chicago, and there were a couple opportunities I had to think long and hard. Like, do I want to move when I've established roots and, like, have a network and all these things? And that's something which a lot of those types of choices now, like, are gone. Like, you can have both. You can have it both ways in some ways. And it's kind of something that I actually have now. Like, I've started two jobs actually remotely, basically over the pandemic. There was one where my first firm I lateraled into, I was in the office for 1 week before we all shut down in March 2020. That was interesting, kind of basically being purely remote. But I kind of started like sort of hybrid in May 2021. And right now, actually, pretty much the entire team I work with, like within my IP practice group, are all on the East Coast. Like, I have a partner that's like permanently remote in Grand Rapids. The rest of my team is in New York. Yet we're able to really communicate effectively, get kind of good working environments and relationships. And it's just something where I think it's about intentionality. Like, we're potentially I have a big firm that gets a small group, but like kind of keep each other apprised of various things. Like, we always have a weekly task list, so we see, okay, what is everybody working on? So you get a sense of everybody's bandwidth. And I often find that that's just like really been a good way for me to give a sense in terms of like boundaries, so to speak. Like, okay, knowing how much I have and to do, and kind of figuring out like, okay, sometimes even asking like, okay, like, when is this due? Like, when can I kind of know when I work best, say, for example. So say for a lot of times you may have people more available in the morning. So, okay, well, let me make sure I'm more available, like kind of, ready to go with certain emails in the morning. But one thing I do want to address about boundaries is that people talk about their own boundaries, but for every type of thing that you may do, like, and this is, I think, why it's important to get to know like your work colleagues and everything, is that that's another place. I mean, the work has to get done no matter what. I mean, whether that's like maybe a partner has to do it or a senior associate. I mean, they may be busy. They have a lot of stress and expectations too. So a lot of times it's kind of figuring out, knowing, okay, is this something that has to immediately get done? Is this something where maybe, no, I can't do it? Because I mean, I know like I can sometimes have a hard time saying no to things. things. I just kind of do. But I always kind of figure like, well, life always finds a way, and you kind of make time for the things that are important, and really kind of recognizing that, okay, in some cases, like a colleague who may be swamped, like if you say no, that puts that on them, and that's frankly not really a fair or nice thing to do at times.
Well, thank you, Kenny. Yeah, I think one of the points I think you touched on obviously is how this technology and sort of this accessibility is both a blessing and a curse to some degree. I appreciate the insight as far as how the blessing side of it, right? Because I think a lot of these discussions do revolve around, how much more in touch with work I think most people are now, at least have been during the pandemic. So let's go next to, I think, Rachel Honeycutt. I think you were the middle one. Get your perspective on this, and I know this is going to be a little different, right? Because we just heard from two individuals who were at the associate level, and now between Rachel and Ruda, we're talking in-house, and then when we go to Rachel Carnaggio, we're talking at the partner, at the senior leadership level. So I'd like to hear, working the way up, how these boundaries work and how remoteness has affected, the work-life balance.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because with the boundaries and the work-life balance, I think for me, I started to put a lot of the boundaries into place, pre-COVID, and kind of I think a little around for my career trajectory, is helpful going into this. So, similar to what Dardo is saying about her experience, I've been a single parent, full-time caregiver since my daughter was about, like 3 or 4, and she'll be 15 in December. So, that's been a lot of my professional career. So one of them was, similar, putting you have different priorities, different stages in your life. In my late 20s, early 30s, I loved everything about, the law firm lifestyle. I liked the traveling. I liked, the socializing, the happy hours, the crazy hours, the intensity of it. And then, once my daughter was born, and especially once I became a single parent, things really shifted. So I made partner at my firm, and I think I was partner for about a year or two. And then, with having to travel for litigation, figure out childcare, like the stress and anxiety that every aspect of that would put on me, the feeling pulled in multiple directions, I made the decision to leave. And I went to the Postal Service for a few years. I was senior IP counsel there, and now I'm with JAG at MRDC. And what I did, and I got better about, is when I went to the Postal Service, it was really culture shock going there, not getting the emails in the evening, checking my phone to make sure that it was still working, that everything was still coming through. But, what I'll say is, during COVID, the in-house lifestyle didn't change kind of like the on-call aspect, and I think everyone knows things got really busy at the Postal Service during COVID. And, it became evident that it was critical to the nation's infrastructure. And, we had to work on the weekends, we had late nights. But for me, being able to do that from home, make dinner, step away, be present for my family, that was enough. And, so I think a lot of what you'll hear from the different panelists is, it's what works for you and what your priorities are. But, so for me, I'm okay answering the phone and jumping on it as long as I'm able to then, help her with the soccer, do whatever needs to get done. And, kind of what Kenny was talking about with starting right before COVID, I had a friend that joined the Postal Service that Monday, and we shut down everything on Tuesday and started working remotely. And what I started doing with the group is I would have weekly, Zoom meetings, and we would check in with each other, see how people were doing. You'd have part of it be the workflow, making sure that work was being spread around the group, but then also really just checking in on people and making sure that, people had what they need for work. But, as we got more established into the remote aspect, it was, hearing about what's going on in people's families, walks, gardening tips, things, shared recipes. We really used it a lot to just, keep engaged with each other. So for me, the remote lifestyle is great. I embrace the Zoom aspect of it. Not an hour and a half commuting to and from work, and just log on so I'm available. It's all huge. So for me, the boundaries of going in-house worked out better, but you're still available. And I know Ruth is going to talk to a lot of the that you're still having to be there for your in-house clients, but you figure out what works for you, and it's just sticking to it. It's just sticking to your values and what's important. And I think for me, that's really what helps with the mental health is taking that time to do what I feel is important.
Thank you for that. And actually, we'll eventually come
So
back
I'll pass
to
it to you, Ruta, if you want to jump in on the in-house side.
Yes, please. And trust me, I'm gonna come back to you eventually about the what works for you approach too, from sort of a broader scale. So just keep that in the back of your mind too. Go ahead, Ruta.
So I have a lot of experience of working remotely, and just taking a step back, when I went to law school, I already had kids. I had my daughter was 2 years old, and my son she was 2 years and 10 months, and my son was 10 months old. They're just 2 years apart. So I had a baby and a toddler, and a very supportive husband and family. But it was still, the law school was challenging. Not as challenging. In fact, the kids were a nice distraction when I came home, and I missed out on a lot of the parties, but that was fine. So when I started working, and my career graph was such that I started at a very large international law firm. Then I went to an IP boutique firm, and I became a partner there. And then just recently, last year, during the pandemic, I went in-house at Eli Lilly. So all throughout my career, technology and ability to work remotely has been my friend. I really liked the freedom, that I could go to my kids' school and I could step out for 30 minutes and take a call. I could have, I was one of those people, and many of you may be too young, or I don't know, but when I started working, there was BlackBerry, and I constantly had my BlackBerry, and I would be checking my emails all the time on it. So I thought that was good, that was liberating, that just allowed me to take vacations, spend time with my family, but yet be connected to my work and stay on top of my deadlines. Then when I was an associate at Sheridan Ross, the IP boutique firm, I actually, just like Dardo said, for 2 years, my husband and I decided that we wanted to move to India and give our kids the experience of being there. My husband was doing a startup, and I had family reason, I have family in India. So for all of those reasons, we decided to move to India for 2 years. And that was my first official remote working, right? Because I was in a different country. But again, I was able to, first, I had to convince my law firm that I could do that. Two, they trusted me, and so I did it. I actually thought it worked beautifully. The time lag, I could get the work, I could, get it all done. And when it was morning in US, I was already, I'd sent my work to them. So it worked great. Again, technology was my friend. I loved the ability to be able to do that. My clients knew, but they would always comment on how it was so seamless that they didn't even realize where I was. And then now, and then I came back, and then my law firm, being a IP firm, and we are a lot of patent attorneys and very, technology oriented people. Before the pandemic, we had already started recognizing that people need flexibility, that coming into the office and, being physically present is not really necessary. If a person is hardworking and smart, they're going to work just as well, managing their own time versus you dictating to them that you have to be in this room from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock. So we had already started, making that move. We could work remotely. A lot of my clients are not in Denver. I work with clients on the East Coast and West Coast and foreign clients. So it was already remote, and a lot of the work was done over the phone. There were no Zoom calls, but it was all through phone, and some amount of video conferencing, but not a lot. So I think when the pandemic hit us, it was not that big of a shift for many of us. What was harder is suddenly you were forced to be remote. It was not like your option for that 1 year. You just couldn't step in your office. So we lost a little bit, some collaboration, some face-to-face client meetings, but it was not such a big shock. And then today, like last year when I moved to Eli Lilly, now I'm officially remote because Eli Lilly and all of my colleagues are in Indianapolis, and I live in Boulder, Colorado. So I joined Lilly as a remote attorney. And again, it hasn't stopped anything at all. In fact, if anything, I like remote working. I think it's very efficient. I can talk to people. Everybody is kind of on a same level, right? You're all little pictures on the screen. So whether you know someone for a long time or you don't know them, in a room full of attorneys, when you walk in, or not just attorneys, but strangers, you walk into a room full of strangers and you feel a little hesitant to just walk up to somebody and start talking to them. But I feel like in the virtual world, we're all the same. And somebody's talking and I raise my hand and I have a question, and it all kind of feels like a level playing field. And now at Lilly, we are going back. The forced remote for everybody is going away. So my indie colleagues are back in the office. And now actually I'm starting to feel a little bit of they're all in the room and they're chatting and laughing, and I'm here on the screen, right? So I think so. My bottom line is I think remote working technology, it all, I consider them as additional options to work well. But as other panelists have said, you have to make it work for you. The technology gives you options. Now, what you do with those options is up to you. So you could take those options and become super stressed, which also happens because now there is an expectation that you have emails and you can, you are available, you are connected, or it's like maybe 4:30 people maybe wouldn't set up a meeting because they knew you had to get going, but now they're like, oh, there is no commute. It's 5:30. Well, I know Ruta works late. I'm just gonna ping her and see what she's doing, and that happens. So last night I was working late. I like to work late and just kind of have no distractions. And I had team members from India where it was morning, and they were like, oh, do you have a minute? And I started replying to one person, and then another person, oh, do you have a minute? And so those are the things I think that happen. And it is up to you. I sometimes think that it's actually easier to take questions right away and kind of respond right away. But that's just my personality. But definitely setting boundaries is critical because it can pretty quickly get overwhelming. So my advice is use the technology as your friend, and but be sure to set those boundaries. Set your out of office. If you don't want to be disturbed, you can change the setting on your computer that you're busy, or you're focusing, or just plain out of office so no one can reach you at those times. But I think as a working mom, the remote and all of this has been tremendously helpful for me.
Thank you, Ruta. And so, last but not least, Rachel. Now, so I know this question is a little bit more complicated for you because you were promoted during the pandemic, and so how you might have been accessible before the pandemic would probably have changed drastically, regardless of the pandemic, right? And so, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about setting these boundaries, and if you can sort of prognosticate on how it might have been different either way.
Sure. Well, I don't know that there were that many stressors as far as doing that transition, because I still had the same. To make partner, you have to do business development, and you have to be doing, billing, looking at invoices. So I was already doing all of this unbillable work beforehand, and that leads to stress because you're doing unbillable work and it's taking away from your billable time. So those kinds of stresses were still there. So I didn't have too much of a transition going into being a partner in COVID, but there was, you got to stay there. So you got to keep up the business development, and some clients want to meet in person and shake your hand, and other ones want nothing to do with you, and they don't even want to use a Zoom. So you have to adapt. And so, that was a different kind of stress. But, as far as boundaries, I think that I started before COVID, and I had a similar experience to Ruta where, I have a firm that allows more flex time. We're technology oriented, so our clients aren't even in the same state. It's easily to, you can do invention disclosure meetings online, and it's just not imperative to be in the office. It doesn't matter where you sit. So another issue is, for me, being a mom of 2 kids, and during COVID, elementary school kids, it's just being able to have certain flexibility. It was actually a good thing for me to be home and to be accessible to them. But there were times where I still had to go to the office because I had to get away from those 2 elementary school children in order to really do some work. And luckily, even though it was COVID, I was allowed to go downtown and go into that office. But, working for a firm that has a lot of flexibility is a great thing. I know not everyone can land that kind of job, but it's something certainly to strive for.
Wonderful. And Rachel Honeycutt, I noticed your comment in chat, if you want to elaborate on that as well.
Sorry, it takes a second to switch over and unmute. No, I mean, look, probably a lot of us on the panel and people in the audience, like Ruta was saying, it's a blessing to have the phones and the devices so that you are accessible and you can communicate when you're not together in person. For me, it was also a bit of a curse at times, like the ding of the phone, the BlackBerry, or when it was my personal, it was triggering at times, like you're getting ready for Thanksgiving, you're in the car and it just keeps going off, and you just know in the back of your mind, like these are all emails that, maybe you need to respond to in the moment, maybe you can't. And, what I did get better about, and I think it's hard, like it'd be interesting to see Kenny's perspective, but, I think as you are more senior, it's easier to establish the boundaries, also because you've been working with people longer, and you know what's acceptable and what's not, and what, you really need to be doing and what you don't need to be worrying about. I have it go on silent now at 10 o'clock during the week. I don't look at my work phone first thing in the morning. I used to sleep with my work phone next to me, look at it first thing in the morning. If it went off in the middle of the night, I would be waking up for it. To me, that's critical, is not only setting the expectations with your coworkers, but really, putting those boundaries around you so that you don't feel like you're always, accessible. Like, you need that time to yourself.
Well, Kenny, you've been called out. What do you have to say?
All right then. So, well, there's a couple interesting points. Is that, well, I've seen this now with a lot of colleagues, and I mean, this is the case with mine where I don't have a separate work phone. It's all on one phone. Like, the email gets installed into your personal phone. Like, a lot of companies are adopting bring your own device to work policies. And I mean, generally I know it's pretty secure, but I kind of find that I'll be like responsive, like pretty much like when I can be, just because I know like, and now that I'm like more of a mid-level, like I'm very much the type of person where, again, like I've told people, even like a simple, I can't get to it right now, but maybe sometime later, like that's like perfect for me for peace of mind. Because I mean, it's important, I've found, just because at least in that way I kind of know the work is getting done. I mean, I'm also just kind of fine with like sometimes like working a little bit later at nights, like when it's necessary, just because like I'm learning a lot of stuff. I think it's interesting. I mean, I also frankly don't, I think I'm the only panelist that does not have children and who is not married. So, I mean, that's also something which I know that's like a different life stage, frankly, that I'm in. But I mean, I know it's like I'm learning a lot. I like the tech. I like the because I like my team so much, like it's an extra motivator. Or even if maybe you're not aware of it, if you really like the people you work with, or I mean, yeah, sometimes my boss and I will even like text each other about whatever, which I mean, that's like great because it's kind of fun. It's like a level of getting to know each other. It's personal. But I would just say that kind of one thing I found is that one thing that's interesting is that, I mean, with having everything on one phone, like, I'll check my email, but a lot of things it'll be, there's like certain things that come every day, like, oh, Law 360 or like Docket Navigator will come. I'll check that. But I mean, one thing I kind of told people about a little bit is that, well, I mean, okay, there's like maybe depending on the week, like a few times a week, I do like the high intensity classes at like 6 a.m. at the gym. So like, I'm probably not gonna, I haven't gotten too many emails at that time of the morning, but like, it's just something that I know, like I do, it like kind of gets me up, kind of retrained myself to be like, well, okay, like I used to be more of a night owl. I mean, now I'm kind of adjusting the other way, but it's something that I find like having a little bit of a routine, like getting, like just even if it's like something that's not related to work at all, like at that time of the morning, it's like it's a level of accomplishment, just because again, it's like something physical. You can kind of see like, oh, I'm lifting more weights, or I can do, or especially for someone like me, where many people have told me outside of Zoom, if I've only met them via Zoom, it's like, wow, you're a lot taller than I thought, because I'm 6'6", and it used to be hard to touch my toes, but that flexibility was like, holy cow, I can really do it now. Like, but again, it's like something, if there's like a certain activity where, if say for example, okay, there's a time I have to take my kids to school, like you can tell, okay, generally this is when I have to do that, so I'll get to it then. Or even then, like at least within my firm, like we do a lot if people have to be out of the office for doctor's appointments or certain things. Like, yeah, we'll just like set up, so the group email just flat out like calendar invite out of office this day, like, which I'm actually doing in a couple of weeks. Yeah, I've already set mine up for in a couple of weeks when I'm moving into my condo. So I know like, okay, well, there's an out of office like set up. I know I'll have to like, so people will know, even if I don't necessarily, even if I forget to put the out of office like email thing, like they'll know because it's on the calendar.
Thank you. And whenever we started talking about those sort of the triggering aspect of those emails during some of those times. Dotto, I noticed you made a face as well, and obviously you come at it from the associate perspective, right, as well, with maybe less of an ability to set those boundaries, and now especially so because you've moved firms, right, and maybe have you met your team in person at all, or so
No.
relationship? Yeah. So can you explain? I mean, do you have anything to add? I guess, like I said, being at that level, being a mother of a very young child, and not having that connection with your team necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, I operate pretty well just on a personal level, like working independently, and I'm a bit more of an introvert, so it hasn't been necessarily the most stressful aspect for me, not being able to be in personal contact physically with my colleagues. But there are little things that have been helpful being a new employee at an organization where you haven't met anyone in person. I mean, I think, just being able to, especially if you're working with someone new, if I'm working with a new member or anyone who I haven't really officially met yet, just being able to connect on Zoom and have a quick little conversation before we get down to business. I think that's kind of helpful. And then, of course, I have family in the United States that I visit several times a year. So on my next trip back to the US, I'll be making a trip out to Austin to meet my colleagues for the first time, which will be kind of cool. But yeah, little things like that I think are important when you're working remote, to just maintain those human connections. But I think, it's surprising how you can do that without even being in physical proximity to people.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you. So I know one of the things that Rachel Honeycutt mentioned was, sort of in doing these things and setting those boundaries and finding that balance, you have to do what works for you, right? Whatever that means. Now, from a sort of broader perspective, is the what works for you approach, let's say, can a firm or a company capture that from a very high level way of thinking, to allow certain things to happen on the employee level, or is that more something that has to happen, and certain teams have to be given flexibility to deal individually with their individuals? Is that something that maybe a firm or a company can take a sort of broad approach on, or is that something that has to be dealt with more sort of intimately, I guess? Rachel Honeycutt, did you have any feelings on that, or is that just a personal thing that each individual person has to know what works for them and has to persuade their boss to let them do things?
Well, I think that's the thing, because you've heard a lot of different perspectives about what people are looking for in their work. And, to be honest about, where I am right now, I want to be able to, work. I want to be able to interact with my team. But for me personally, instead of going out for happy hour out after work and, doing those types of team bonding, I'd rather be coming home, spending time with my family, or, trying to see friends that I don't get to see a lot. So I think for the work environment, it's something that you have to look to, so the first firm where I was, it was, a large international firm. The second firm was, it started as 2 offices and then reduced size to, 1 office in DC. And, there, when you're at a general practice firm, you have the firm environment and then you have your practice group environment. And, we had some groups that, pre-COVID, they were really big on FaceTime, and you had to be there. My group, it wasn't, as long as you were billing and getting your work done, you could work remotely, do whatever you needed to do. So the people that had more of a requirement to be in the office, and again, this is pre-COVID, I think you saw a little bit more turnover there because it was more of a rigid aspect, and not just looking at the billable hour requirement, which, I think that, that's kind of like the positive and the negative of billables is, on the one hand, I feel they're horrible because, the other day my internet was down at work and all I could think about was, thank God that this isn't, a billable day and I can just, do other work and I don't have to feel like I'm making up the day later, you might as well just take the day off because you're not billing anything. But it's a nice one that you can, just point to and say that if you're working remotely, you're getting your hours in and, it's an easy accounting metric for that. But, and I was talking with Rachel Carnaggio earlier today about this, to me, employers, need to be the creativity that employers use during the COVID pandemic. I would hope that they continue to employ those as, we return more to the normal environment. I've only been in my current position for about 6 months and I started remote, then was in the office and then, I'm in 2 days a week now. But at the Postal Service, we were really very effective. We got a ton done in those, year and a half that I was there during COVID. We onboarded, had them integrated. We utilized tools that, we didn't realize, we had in our hand at the time. And I think that's where it needs to be is, what, on the management level, how do you, keeping your team engaged isn't always the same for each people. And you just have to recognize that. I know that was a little bit rambling, but I think that it's a case by case. You have to find what works for you. But then, the companies also need to figure out, is it your firm environment that's really what matters? Is it your group environment? And just recognizing that not all people are the same, that maybe for some of them, like meeting, once a week and having your team meetings is enough. Or when if people have to be in the office, is it just being in the office to work, or are you scheduling real substantive interactions on those days that they're in the office?
Right.
Yeah, I know we've had this discussion where we've talked about IP, you can work anywhere, but for maybe the litigation group, it's different. Maybe you need to have people in the office and interacting, and it's better to have somebody be able to go down the hall and be able to ask a quick question, but also just the nature of what your work actually is might warrant more in-person activity. So that's been an issue. But I think if you don't keep up that creativity that you're talking about, Rachel, then you're going to have an issue because a lot of other companies and firms are, and you need to be able to compete. So I've heard many younger associates say, well, I wouldn't even consider that firm because they would require me to go into the office. And they've already had a taste of what it's like to not have to do that. And so why would they do that? Well, because they're having dollars thrown at them, because that's what firms are doing now, right? Everybody's upping the ante and they're trying to give these competitive high associate wages. And then, well, how do you compete with that? Well, some firms just keep raising it, but other ones you have to offer something else because there's a group of people who are going to say, I don't want the money. I don't need the money. I don't care. And I want something else. I want flexibility. I want quality of life. I want something different. So what are you going to do to address that? Well, are you going to have the weekly meetings, the practice group meetings like that? Are you going to have flex time, which means that depending on where you are in your life, maybe you want to go to 50% FTE or 85% FTE. And maybe it's not necessarily, okay, I'm going to drop back a little bit so I can have kids. It doesn't matter what the reason is. It's just because it's your life and you don't want to work 100%. Is your firm going to support that? Well, we better, because we need to be more creative and have these innovative, other ways to pull people in. And that's just one of them. Another one is, okay, so now you're reducing your FTE and letting people do that. Can they still be promoted? Do you just say they can still make partner, or can they really make partner? Because I've seen both at different firms. And so that's obviously a way that a firm can be a little more competitive.
And I'll add to both the Rachels, because I have been in these discussions too, as a partner at the law firm. We were looking at this. I realize now we were very ahead of our time, but we were thinking about this before even the pandemic, as to how to keep associates happy. And I have to say, it is a bit of a two-way street, right? If both sides have to get something out of it. If you think somebody works well, and what is working well, is that means that they're responsive, and people who work hard are always going to be the ones in demand. But when an associate, I would say from an associate's perspective, as a partner, I want somebody who I can give work to, and then they're just going to do the work and run with it. I want them to be responsive, and I want them to be, aware of the deadlines and do the work, right? Otherwise, why would I go out of my way to do something for you? It is a two-way thing. And so I think that it's clear that as an associate, you need to advocate for yourself, and you need to communicate clearly what works for you. However, you also need to know that the person on the other side needs somebody to do that work. And so you have to prove to them that if you are going to need all that freedom, then you are actually going to use that freedom and, not disappear or, do what you're expected to do. So I think it's a tricky kind of a situation, because I think that what is required is clear communication, because what one associate needs, another may not need. Like one maybe needs, more flexibility, and another one maybe doesn't want the flexibility, and they prefer working 8 to 5, and they work super focused 100%, and they disappear at 5 o'clock, and then they don't want to be bothered, right? And the same partner has both those associates and knows that both of them are great. So the partner has to kind of make it work. So at my when I was a partner at Sheridan Ross, I think we tried to give flexibility to individual partners to decide how to run their group, and because they know better what they need and how the group dynamic is. But it is also clear now, like, Rachel Carnaggio said about companies, if you're too hard, you're going to lose people. I think that I was just reading in New York Times, I think, about Google had, a lot of the tech companies that started mandating that people come back, and they just found that they're losing people if they start, having such a hardline approach. So now they're all backing off, and giving money is one option, but I can tell you that money is not the single most, it's not, it is a motivational factor, clearly it's important, but it's not even the most important factor. People like to be valued. They like to work with people they like. I've seen research on this. And those actually become the major factors. If you're happy at your job, if you think you're doing valuable work and you think you're being recognized, then you're less likely to go somewhere else for a few extra dollars. Now, if somebody is doubling your salary, okay, that's another matter. But it's not a simple give 10% raise and you're going to get that person away. So I think that, to me, it is communication. Your team leaders need to communicate, make people feel valued, make sure that they're compensated, in accordance with their work output. So all that goes in, and maybe when you're working remotely, is that a bit harder? When you're in person, maybe people have better relationships. So that's something one needs to figure out. But otherwise, yeah, I think it is. It's certainly today it's a seller's market. What if you're selling goods, there is a shortage. If you're selling good services, you're going to be lapped up, and you can kind of dictate to some degree what you want.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it sounds like I'm hearing basically at sort of a management level, very high level, they have to allow flexibility between the teams as the team, and then sort of at the team level, that's where you sort of make those decisions based on both what the team needs and what the individuals in that team need. Does that make sense, or is that just a lot of gooey? All right, perfect. So I know we've spent a lot of time focusing on maybe what associates might care a little bit about, but actually, first let me remind the audience very quickly that we do take questions, right? So if you have any questions or anything you want answered from the panel while we're still here, please feel free to put that in the Q&A tab. I do have it open, I promise. So if you post something there, I will see it. So now I'll pivot. I know we've focused a lot on sort of associate style level stressors, but a little early in our program, Bill McGrath posted sort of a comment in chat. He said, "Perfection expectations," we were obviously talking about perfectionism, is not just a problem for associates. Clients expect partners to provide perfect services too. Keeping clients satisfied can be very stressful. And I know a few people on the panel here sort of wanted to talk about, that almost exact topic, right? Of, what's it like going from associate to partner, associate in-house or partner in-house, right? And how those stressors have changed, or not, for that matter. And I know there's a few of you who have experience moving throughout that way. So, I mean, I think Ruta, you wanted to talk a little bit about that going in-house, sort of that transition. And I guess so. First question would be: what was the lure of going in-house? Partially because you could set those boundaries a little easier, right? There was a little bit of a mental health benefit to transitioning to that venue.
Yeah, and I think this is a great question, and Bill McGrath's question is really great too. And I think the answer to that is, I sometimes feel that I was maybe less stressed when I was an associate. I mean, I had stresses, of course, because I had to work, targets and all that. But you did the work, and you knew you did a good job, and you felt good. But as you get more senior, you realize that a lot of things could go wrong. So I find that my stress has increased from that perspective, because now I know better. And so whenever something is done, my question is, okay, now how can somebody tear it apart? And when this patent gets into litigation, what are they going to look at? And so I think that when your stress, does it increase? Maybe I don't want to say increase, because I think everybody feels the stress at their level, but the nature of the stress, I think changes. And it is a similar thing going from in-house, going from law firm to in-house. So, when you're an associate, you might think, oh, I'm doing all this work, and, the partner's breathing down my neck, and, they don't have any stress, they just give me work. But the partner actually has a lot of stress, because whatever work the associate does, the partner has to, if the client doesn't like it, or if something comes up, the partner is the one who's going to be responsible, right? So they are carrying their own stress. Similarly, there is this feeling that if you're in the law firm, it's a lot more stressful because you have billable hours and marketing and client development pressures. And when you go to in-house, if work is too much, you can always farm it out to outside counsel, right? I mean, at least that's what I thought when I was in law firm. But you come in-house, and maybe because I'm in pharmaceutical, which is like the most intense, stressful IP field, where patents are, like I said, if your patents are going to be worth, they're going to back a $1 billion product, and you have done the work for it. So you did something, somebody didn't claim priority right or something. I won't go into the details of patent law, but the patent attorneys, if there are any in the audience, will know exactly what I'm talking about. So it's a different type of stress. And yes, there is no hours, there's none of that profitability cloud, but there are different types of stresses, because when you're in law firm, I realize now, when the work comes to you, there is an in-house counsel who has determined that they're going to engage you to look at this problem, and that problem is reasonably defined. You go in-house and you're getting questions from from business people and from scientists, and there are quick questions that you have to provide answers for, right? And then you're like, no, wait, this is not a yes or no question. That is, I need to know what are you doing, why are you doing, when do you want it done? There is a lot of ambiguity. So I think the stress about in-house is dealing with ambiguity, communicating clearly to folks who are not attorneys, but communicating the risk to them clearly. So sometimes you try to be too clear, and it starts sounding too simple and black and white, and you don't want to do that. So it's a fine line. If you try to give too much legalese answers, people's eyes are going to glaze over, and they're going to be like, okay, you're not really telling me anything. I don't know. What should I do? That's always the question. So what do you want me to do, right? And then you are replying. In a law firm, you are telling another lawyer what to do a lot of the times. And that lawyer is you can communicate with them because they are kind of on the same page. But when you're communicating with business people or your teams, that's not the case. So I think that was kind of an interesting realization that, every job has stresses. But other than that, I think there's also, I like it. There's a really nice feeling of being in a team when you're in-house. I mean, you're all working for a certain product together. You're not working, it's not as transactional a relationship as when you're in a law firm. And I have to say, I was fortunate that I had some clients at law firm where I felt like I was in-house, because they would literally pick up the phone and call, and we would discuss things. But a lot of clients, they want to, because you're charging them by the minute, by increments of 6 minutes, so they are more hesitant to call you all the time. But in-house, you truly feel like you are a team. And I would just put one last thought here, and I think what really helps for me, and I think for other people too, if you try this, is sometimes it's good to take a step back and look at the big picture and say, why are we doing what we are doing? And when you look at the big picture, I think you can kind of start, some of your stress maybe you can put it in a box because you understand the whole picture. And so you stop sweating over really tiny matters. Because in our work, every day, you get inundated with questions, and each question, honestly, is pretty stressful in itself. But when you take a step back and look at the big picture, you kind of start seeing, let the real issues rise, and let's not get too hung up over some of the little matters. And that is the thing for me. That moment was, I was last week I was at an event, a Lilly company here in Boulder, and one of the patients came up and spoke. She tried a cancer therapy that was one of our drugs, and it was a new drug, and she had a really terrible diagnosis, and very few days to live. And she was a mom. She's a doctor actually herself, and this drug just gave her a new lease of life. And I think just listening to that was really powerful, and it suddenly made me feel like what I do is valuable, is important, and took my mind away from the stress and from the good that these products do. And so I think that every now and then it's a good thing to kind of take a step back and think of those things.
Well, thank you, Ruta. Rachel Honeycutt, I know you had wanted to provide a little insight on this one too, I believe. Sort of whether or not the work-life balance had any impact on your decision to go in-house, or because I think you went from being a partner to going in-house. So anything that can you elaborate on the decision to do that, to take those steps from a mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. And I touched on it a little bit earlier. For me, it was, the work-life balance that led to it. And it also feeds in nicely with what Ruta was talking about with, the salary aspect. So for me, I went from a partner at a law firm to the government, and that was a pretty significant pay cut. But it was very important to me to have that change in work-life balance. And again, everyone's been talking about the different things that are important to them. For me, one of the main factors was, taking travel off the table. That's where I saw it was stressing me out, giving me anxiety. Was, so not only, I have my daughter, had 2 dogs, and it was trying to figure out, all right, who's going to be watching my daughter? Luckily, my sister lived close by, but then you need the dog sitter. And, if you're going away for, whether it's 2 days, 3 days for depositions, or, a week or 2 for trial, I wanted the travel off the table. It's one thing, and the sudden unplanned travel, So when I was interviewing, that questions I was asking, and I'm very upfront about myself, and I'll ask the questions that I want an answer to. And I think that's really important too, as you go through your career, is don't sell yourself short by not asking the questions that are important to you. So for me, traveling is not an issue, being in the office isn't an issue, but I want to be able to plan for it if I need to be able to figure out childcare. Now that my daughter's older, it's not as big of a deal, but those are the types of things that were important at the time. And also, Ruta was talking about what drove me to my current position with the government is the substance of the work. I've been doing a lot of COVID-related work with MRDC, and that gives me the satisfaction, being able to do what I feel is important for, Rachel was talking about, the kids at home during the remote learning. I want to avoid that again as much as I can. That was horrible. So making sure that, we have the vaccines out there, that, we're doing what we can to help support the acquisitions of the antivirals, that gives me the satisfaction at work. So it was the transition, leaving a large salary on the table, but the counterpoints of, the substance of the work, having a lot of work, not having to travel, that's what drove me and what keeps me where I am now. You're still working hard, but then I think when you go, at least for me, you know, leaving the firm and going to a team in-house, there are people that can cover for you too when you are on leave, you know, so you feel like you can shut off, walk away, you know, go away on a trip. You know, if you need to be available for a call, you can do it, but that part's just been easier for me with going to transition in-house.
Oh, great. And Rachel Carnegie, do you have anything to add as far as perspective on, you know, the stressors going from associate to partner? I know earlier you talked sort of, you touched on it briefly that, you know, it's only a little different because a lot of the sort of non-billable stuff you've been doing for some time now. But yeah, can you talk a little bit about how the stresses have changed, stayed the same, and maybe how you've had to manage that transition as well?
I think they've mostly stayed the same. I mean, there are additional responsibilities I have now, but I still have a lot of the same stressors. But one thing that Ruta said that struck me is recently I volunteer. I'm on the board of a nonprofit, STEM Blazers, that exposes middle school and high school girls to STEM careers. And I was going to this 9th grade class and I was telling these girls about what I do. And it gave me like this new, renewed perspective of what I do. And it was like, oh yeah, I forgot. I have the coolest job on earth. And just telling them about it was so awesome. It was like, I just got caught up in like working and billing and taking care of this legal nightmare every day. And because I was looking at it like that. But then when it's like, it's like, I got to remind myself like, oh yeah, I have the best job ever. So that kind of helps reduce my stress right now. It's just remembering that. But it has been stressful and it gets more stressful. So you really need to learn how to cope for sure and get that balance down. I mean, all of us are really smart people, but it's really interesting how so many really smart people can't figure it out, how to manage stress sometimes.
Sure, thank you. And with the last 20 minutes, this could take a pretty a decent amount of time to discuss it. I want to turn to the concept of mentorship, sort of generally. One of the reasons why really sort of I'm personally interested in this, right? You start talking about one of the things we brought up earlier. We're talking about retention, whether it be associate retention, whether it be retention of anybody, right? Firm or company. You know, one of the things that we started talking about was this level of connectivity, sort of creating these authentic relationships with your team, liking your team. Even one of you mentioned, you know, that definitely helps sort of manage the stress and maybe even get you to stick around maybe longer than you would initially like. And I know there's a few of you that have some perspectives on some mentorship generally, and you know, I want to ask this question and approach it from two different ways, right? So from the first is obviously from, you know, the associate perspective, right? You know, how do you find mentors? You know, how successful have you been, and all that. But you know, one of the sort of questions that I have looming over my head is, especially when thinking of mental health generally, is, well, why should more senior attorneys care, right? Senior attorneys, you know, you got to where you were under the current sort of state of things, right? And so whether that was caring about mental health, whether that was having to put your mental health aside, I would sort of want to explore this idea of mentorship in that way, right? So it's not just looking at the perspective from the associates, but also, you know, what even the mentors can get out of these relationships, whether it means increased retention, whether it means just a better connection with your team, whether it means on a personal level, maybe it means getting a friend. I know, Kenny, you mentioned you sometimes text on non-legal things, which is just unfathomable to some people, right? With your leadership. So, mentorship is obviously important, and I say that because in a recent ABA book that I picked up, the term mentor actually appears it's the 5th most time cited in the index, behind, to no one's surprise, billing time, emails, and assignments. And it's tied with clients, so just keep that in mind. So I want to start with these questions of where do you suggest going to find a good mentor? And Kenny, you can start. I think you indicated some interest in this one.
Yeah, sure thing. So one thing in general, like, I'm going to say this much. I hate the word mentor. Like, I think it sounds too formal, too clinical, frankly, when ideally, like, a mentor-mentee relationship, and I tell this to people, it's a two-way street. Like, it's not someone coming on from down high to give you their wisdom and, oh my God, this is like the gospel or something, the gospel according to the mentor or something. No, that's not it. I even remember I was reading a survey of like another bar association I'm in when they had talked about mentoring, and there was somebody who was a bit more of a senior practitioner that said, I wish that more reverse mentoring was happening, because I, like, whether it's technology or other like different perspectives from younger people, I think people approach this like too transactional, like it's a one-way street, you learn and that's it. And maybe the mentor feels like, oh, I'm just doing this to feel good about myself. But I've often found that it kind of takes time, like, and I found that I'd approach it in gradations. Like, when I was first practicing, like, I started off at a very small firm, like it was basically like a solo. So I would talk to people, just like kind of ask for advice and realize like, okay, like I would have a question about something or kind of want to get to know people because I knew it was important. And like kind of approaching it where, okay, some people, everybody can teach you something. It might be a good thing. It might be neutral. It might even be bad. But like you can learn something from everybody, whether you meet up with them one time or frankly, if you think it's somebody that you know that can be a bit of a more long-term, somebody that you would really want to learn from, like keep up with them, like follow up every few months, be like, hey, it's been a while. Like, do you want to like catch up? Do you want to talk about, like, I just did this, like, let's talk about this or something, or how are, like, even like sending like certain, I don't know if it's like holiday emails or cards, but I found like the people that were long-term, like, again, were people that kind of became like friends to me in some ways, whether sometimes like, I don't know, we'd send each other gifts, or say for like, I think, again, like I had mentioned earlier, how I'd step out of office, or like when I'm moving in, like I've had a couple of people say, like, I've asked questions like, oh my gosh, like, what do I do? I'm going to be a first-time homeowner. Like, what do you paint? Or kind of like certain shared connections where, as you kind of advance throughout your life, or even it's just like, yeah, sometimes you can just sit at the bar. Somebody like, I've met people that have become potential mentors to like potential like bar associations, like through like, well, like I play in a local orchestra. So like I've met people like that have become friends through like the orchestra or something. People can like come out of anywhere. And I think too often people think, oh, senior partner of like 40 years who founded this firm, or somebody who has great litigation results, or somebody who I want to be, or like somebody who I really admire, want to base my career off of. But I've often found that the best ones, or the people who've taught me the most, they haven't fit that mold at all. They've been in other practice areas. They've been, sometimes they've only been maybe a couple years ahead of me, like in terms of years of practice. I mean, I think it's getting rid of that rigidity and thinking like a mentor-mentee relationship is where it's a two-way street where you can become close with each other. And it doesn't matter like where you are in life with each other. And recognize that sometimes you can get advice. It doesn't have to even be long-term. Would it be nice? Yes. Most of the time you don't have to. It could just be something like, okay, I'm going to just take from this one interaction, grow from that.
Well, thank you, Kenny. And also, I would invite any of the panelists to share any experiences that they have either being a mentor or being menteed, any success stories or however you want to phrase it. There are situations that could have been improved upon. Any insight as far as that goes? Rachel Honeycutt, you unmuted, so I presume.
I can jump in with some positive examples. So my last firm, one of the groups I thought did a phenomenal job with it, and it was more of a mentoring program, but the senior associates of counsel partners would work with the first years, second years, and would really, it was just the policy of the group that, for the professional organizations, they would take the people to the meetings, introduce them to colleagues, clients, get them publishing, get them onto, committees, and really make that part of their plan as soon as they started at the firm. And where it came out was once they were mid-levels to senior associates and they were trying to make their case for advancement, they were able to point to all of the networking experiences and help them with the client development. And so that's one where it's the top-down mentorship and ownership of trying to help your new hires advance in their careers to help themselves and help your group. As an associate, what I did, I was strategic with the people that I turned to as mentors. And as our part of the annual review process at the firm, you needed to have somebody that was, more of a sponsor. And I looked to the people whose careers I admired, and they weren't always people in my group. And this isn't something that we really touched on a ton, but, like in IP law, from my experience, with the pharmaceutical patent litigation, there wasn't a ton of women in the group. The first firm where I worked, it was three of us in the group in DC, and then the other firm, it was two of us. So 20% of, or 10-20% of the team was women. And if you wanted to have a mentor who was more like you, sometimes you had to go outside of the group, or you would work with somebody who had the type of clients that you liked, or you saw that they were doing good business development. And with that, and that was one of the things I was discussing with Adam before we had the panel is, some of this falls on the individual. You need to drive your career, and if you feel like you're not seeing somebody in your group as a mentor, find the people. Maybe it's somebody in another group, maybe it's somebody in a professional organization, and you want to do that. And you do have to go outside of your comfort zone sometimes to start those conversations, but you'll find that there's always people out there that want to help. I mean, I love talking to people and trying to help them figure out, what is best for their situation, helping them advance, whether it's, now, with the government or at the firm, but, just trying to figure out that, if you're working and you're there a lot, what's going to help make you happy and successful. And there's a lot of people out there that are like that.
A couple of things I wanted to actually, Rachel, I think you brought up, which were great, is that sometimes it's looking outside, but I've often found that because sometimes there's been formal mentoring programs in firms, and there were some like that I had it just flat out wasn't a good match, or I felt like that they weren't necessarily, they either didn't have the time for it or just didn't have that. That is okay. If you feel if it's not working in one direction or the other, it's not necessarily an obligation. Like it's, again, like a friendship or some other form of deep relationship. if it's not working out, I mean, sometimes it's just that. I mean, it's not like they're necessarily bad people, but sometimes people just don't click. So it takes, I think, time to figure out like where I want to be and where I want to go. And again, sometimes it's people outside, and frankly, it can just be figuring out, do I want to do like this type of business development? Like, I kind of always felt like I had that drive just because like I liked it. I think it's just something I get to learn more, I get to do things. But I mean, sometimes it's just kind of figuring out, some people don't even some people want to go, but like but people may invite people to like certain organizations or opportunities, but then if the mentee doesn't show up and care, well, sometimes like, well, you have to be proactive enough to do it. So like, here's the opportunities, but there's plenty of ways, like whether it's writing articles for your local bar association that an associate can even do in and of themselves. Like, I do think there's a lot of like self-initiative and everything. So, and frankly, like also recognizing that if something isn't working out, cut loose.
Thank you, Kenny. Yeah, and actually, I think both Kenny and Rachel brought up a good point that I think maybe deserves some clarification. Sort of what someone sort of approaching a mentorship relationship, or a relationship, whatever label you want to put on it, sort of what expectation they should have going into it, as far as what maybe not what can be done for them, but what opportunities they should hope to get from that relationship, if that makes sense. So yeah, Rachel, you mentioned some of the things you saw a very successful mentorship program doing, like making introductions, getting out to various things, getting younger associates publishing, getting them on committees, which actually I have a personal anecdote about too, but I think people would be more interested in hearing from the panelists. But so I guess, yeah, what if you had to put yourself in the prospective mentor role, what would you, I guess this is a two-part question, what would you hope that a mentor would sort of bring to the table for a mentee? And then what sort of energy would you hope the mentee would bring to get the most out of that relationship?
Yeah, so I think what I would do is really what's critical on both ends is communication and commitment to working with the other person. So for the mentor, it's not just doing a very cursory approach to it. It's getting to know the person, and again, just going back to our panel, people have different drivers, so is the person wanting to stay, in IP? For me, I wanted to do IP and also do FDA, so can they get the opportunities where they are? Is there a career change that would be beneficial? And I think that's part of it too, as a good mentor, is if it's a good attorney, you want the person to stay where you are and be in your group. But what if something is better for them? And it's being able to give that completely honest advice and share your experiences, what's worked, what hasn't, but a little bit of selflessness with working with the other person, recognizing that when you make the really strong connections, if you're at a firm and they go in-house, that could be a future client, but they will respect you for your advice that you gave them. And for the mentee, to me, what was most important was working with someone who was putting in the time, and I think Kenny was mentioning it, with the devices, that, you want to be able to acknowledge the communication. So, if you set up a meeting, if you're going to have coffee, be present in those meetings when somebody is taking the time to meet with you, and I think especially, when you're at a firm and everyone's worrying about billable hours, to have lunch with somebody, that person is taking away their billable time to meet with you and give you that one-on-one, so don't, pull your phone out talk to the person, communicate. And then, if it is a formal mentoring program and, you have tasks to do, take them seriously. Like if you're having to do an individual development plan or something like that, or, career path goals, think about it and put them down because the person's going to be working with you.
Wonderful. So we have 4 minutes, right, left in this session here. So I'd like to sort of go around and I guess ask each panelist to sort of summarize, their, best practices or best piece of advice related to mental health. I know we obviously touched on probably a lot of it, but you can also feel free to answer the last question that I asked about the mentor-mentee relationship. But I sort of wanted to get one final input from everybody. So I'll start from the order in which I see everybody. So Rachel Carnaggio, you're on the hot seat.
Okay. Well, just to wrap up on the mentor issue, I agree with what everyone said, and that also that you have to sometimes seek out those mentors, because somebody might not be one of the lucky ones in a firm where you're handed a mentor who guides you all the way up to being a partner. Sometimes you have to look outside in different organizations or at the Denver Bar Association or something, for example. But the take home for balance, I started out with this. I really think that mental health in the IP group is all about stress management and finding out, somehow carving out a life for you that allows you to deal with that stress so that you can stay in this profession.
Wonderful. Ruta, you're up next.
Yes. Well, first of all, on mentor-mentee issue, I just want to say it is actually extremely important having good mentors, and the best ones just happen organically, not assigned. But I think that sometimes it's not easy for everybody to feel, for whatever reason, if a person feels out of place for whatever reason, race, gender, age, or they're the only one of their kind in a group of people. I think it helps that the law firm is instituting a program of mentorship. So I would say, whatever way you connect with people or through the programs, it's great to get mentors. There is also a distinction between mentor and sponsor, and you need both, really. So that's that. As far as how to cope with, how to manage mental health, just like Rachel said, I agree. It's stress management. It's part of our job. It never goes away. It just changes its shape maybe, and it's in different forms. But whether you're in-house, whether you're in law firm, whether you're a junior attorney, whether you're a junior partner, whether you're a senior partner, there are stresses all along, and they are just different types. So what do you do? And I think that there is something you can do structurally, like you can have your routines. You can definitely take time for physical health, because if your physical health is taking a toll, your mental health is related to that. So your diet, your exercise, you cannot cut corners with that. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing is having relationships at work, not feeling isolated, because I think the stress becomes overwhelming if you think you can't share it with anyone and it's all on your shoulders, right? So when you start getting that feeling, I hope you have relationships at your law firm or your company where you can talk to other people and say, this problem is just driving me nuts. And then they can, you can chat with them, and you, most often when you speak about it, I think it takes away some of the pressure. So having, mentors, again, in that context is really good too. And then, like I said, every once in a while, take a step back, mentoring. For me, I have mentees and I love talking to them. I actually feel really reminds me how I was when I was starting out, and it makes me feel young and good, you know, and I feel like, oh, I can actually give them some advice now. So I think just doing those things that are related to work, but not complete, but that are of different kind. And then most important, keep a sense of humor. Somebody said, nothing is as important. What is it? Nothing is as important as it seems at the moment. So think about all your most stressful times, and 2 years later you look back and you're like, oh yeah, 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 and then you move on, right? So keep that perspective, and keep a sense of humor about it. It helps.
Thank you. Dano?
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid of taking a break. Don't be afraid of, walking away, going on a vacation, taking some time off, because sometimes that's just what you need to come back rejuvenated and refreshed and ready to devote your energy to your work again. And I think being able to walk away and get a little bit of perspective and get some rest, maybe even just do nothing for a little while, can make you a better lawyer. You can come back to what it is that you love and come back to it with a fresh type of energy. So I think that's important to remind ourselves of as well.
Thank you. Kenny?
Sure thing. So I guess the big overarching topic is, again, managing your stress, but you have to know yourself in order to really actually and effectively manage it. So we've been talking about physical fitness, health and wellness. I mean, sometimes you'll see, okay, here's how you relax. Here's how you do self-care. And it's this entire list. Or I wake up at 4 a.m. to get everything done before I send my kids to school. No, that's not possible for most people, or frankly anybody. Some people be like, oh, I run all the time. It's just never been my gig. I've done some 5Ks, but I do HIIT exercise because it's half an hour. You get in, you get a good sweat, and you know that. Sometimes, for me, getting rid of the stress is, okay, I actually have to dig in and do the work, maybe, that I feel like I'm avoiding. And sometimes just even if it's doing an outline or a paragraph, that's at least something. Other times it's, no, we need to clean the house now and find something. Because sometimes there's just at different points, what may be stressing you out most, whether it's your work environment, your home environment, maybe if it's something that is that kind of knowing, okay, maybe I do need to just clean up the room today or make my bed. Maybe if it's physical fitness, okay, I'm not going to run a marathon right now, or even try a couch to 5K. Maybe I just need to go to the pool or something. Maybe it's just go see that movie you've always wanted to see or something or go see that concert that you would really regret if you think maybe it's if I'm just saying with Springsteen, where maybe their last tour, go see that concert if you want to. There's all these things that if you figure out just from who you know, where you are, maybe in terms of your own abilities and your limits, frankly, what stresses you out, that'll really help.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Rachel Honeycutt, bring it home.
All right. So I'm not going to I feel like we've also been using boundaries a lot. Focus on that. What I'll say, and I don't think people value this enough, is change is okay. That, if don't keep trying to make something work and it's not working, changing careers, changing where you live, whatever it is, I feel like during COVID, we've been using pivoting a lot, but it's all acceptable, even, probably a lot of us, with our career paths, I was a bio major and then I worked, and did research and then I went to law school. Making the decision to change some aspect of your life is okay. And I think that feeds into a lot of the self-satisfaction and helping you with your mental health, because otherwise you're gonna drive yourself crazy trying to keep fixing something that's not fixable.
Actually, Rachel, I think that's a good point, especially with what Anne brought up about working with nice people, is that's a choice too. If you feel like you're not working with nice people, change it. It's in some ways go to a different firm, try a different company. It's not necessarily if you think. Sometimes it's about having a conversation, but if you think it's not worth it, yeah, change. I mean, you could definitely try and change it, or at least take steps to maybe I'll send out a resume, or maybe I'll try and do this in order to try and even having a list of things to do would be helpful.
Welcome back, everyone, for our second and final session of today, our panel on diversity, equity, and inclusion, moderated by Mr. Kyle Cirilla. Mr. Cirilla he's an associate at Mudd Law, and he's also the first IP Law Fellow here at the IP Center. So please join me in welcoming our session 2.
Thanks, Adam. I first want to thank Adam and Professor Lin for bringing me back to the IP Center to moderate, and also to Bill McGrath for starting this event that got kind of passed down to the IP Law Fellow when he stepped down. For those in the audience, please feel free to type any questions you have in the Q&A tab at any time. That's the tab I'm going to have open, and you don't need to wait to the end, so we can kind of put any questions you have organically into the conversation, which is really our point of the day, is to facilitate a conversation between us and all of you. We have a great panel today. I'm going to briefly introduce everybody as they join me on stage here, but I encourage everyone to review their full bios on today's materials. First, I'd like to welcome Laith Abu Tabab. Laith is a Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel at Mori, a food and agriculture tech company focused on anti-waste. Prior to Mori, Laith was an attorney at Finnegan, where his practice included IP litigation, licensing, and portfolio development. He's also taught courses on IP and social justice at Howard University. Next, Esther Lim is a partner and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer with Finnegan Henderson, Garrett, and Dunner in their DC office. She has 25 years of experience in patent litigation and counseling. Esther has taught as an adjunct professor at Howard University School of Law since 2003 and is the patent program chair of its annual IP and Social Justice Conference. She's also a member of the UIC Law IP Center's Advisory Board. Idris McClevely is a vice president and lead patent counsel at the S.T.E. Lauder companies, where he is responsible for designing and executing the company's global patent strategy, supporting more than 30 luxury cosmetic brands. Prior to S.T.E. Lauder, Idris served as patent counsel for Procter & Gamble, managing global patent portfolios for numerous major brands. Daniel Saeed is joining us today. He's a partner at Taft here in Chicago, where he sits as a member on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. He focuses his practices on issues relating to employment law, privacy, and information security. Daniel also frequently speaks on issues relating to diversity, inclusion, and implicit bias. He provides implicit bias training to hundreds of lawyers each year. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Maureen R. Smith. Maureen is an equity partner at Fitch, Evans, Tabin, and Flannery. With more than 2 decades of experience in all aspects of trademark law, she has helped clients in diverse industries select, protect, build, and enforce brands in the United States and around the globe. Maureen has managed portfolios that include some of the most valuable brands in the world and has supervised the development and enforcement of those brands in nearly every jurisdiction. As a former in-house trademark counsel for 2 Fortune 100 companies, Maureen provided key advice to brand owners. So everybody, I want to thank you all for joining us. Today we're going to be focusing our discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues within the legal field, as a whole, but trying to highlight some specific issues to the IP practice as we go. Obviously, this is a big topic, so we could do a whole week, probably conference on this. But for our 90 minutes, we're going to be focusing on tools for change in recruiting and retention for diverse attorneys, as well as overall best practices, looking at firm and in-house cultures. First, as an introduction, even though I feel like I've been speaking for a while, I want to start with some statistics and excerpts that you can actually find in your course materials, but I kind of wanted to highlight. The practice of law remains one of the least diverse professions in America. According to the American Bar Association, only 2 professions have less diversity than law: the natural sciences and dentistry. Women constitute over 1/3 of the attorneys, but only about 1/5 of law firm partners, general counsel of Fortune 500 companies, and law school deans. Although African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans now constitute about 1/3 of the population and 1/5 of law school graduates, they still only account for fewer than 7% of law firm partners. And in IP practice, the numbers are no better. An official comment of patent law scholars to the USPTO from this past May, or I guess 2 Mays ago now, including the following. The lack of diversity among IP practitioners is a well-established problem. According to a 2019 report, about 80% of IP practitioners are male and about 86.5% are white. A recent American Bar Association study found that a mere 22% of patent practitioners are female and only about 6% are racially diverse. This dearth of diversity has both economic and social costs. The IP community may be missing out on improved innovation outcomes and financial returns that flow from increased diversity. So, this possible revenue losses mentioned is real. Studies in recent years have concluded that diversity is embraced. It concluded that when diversity is embraced to form diverse teams, those teams produce high revenues and better financial results. Additionally, in 2018, a research study showed that gender and ethnic diversity in management correlates with profitability. So, outside of diversity, inclusion, and equity being the right thing to do, which it is, it appears that, this actually, the resistance of these items or the lack of policies supporting these ideas are really holding the industry back as a whole. And we have the evidence there, but sort of, why is there still so much resistance? And I think that really brings us to sort of our first idea here, which are sort of these general issues in our culture and our legal culture. And one of those would be implicit bias. So, David, if you wouldn't mind kind of starting us off here, could you give us an explanation of what implicit bias is, and why is it a particularly significant issue in the legal community?
I think you're referring to me.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. That's all right.
Oh, I'm sorry, Daniel. I said David.
Yes, no, happy to, Kyle. Implicit bias, has been a lot discussed on implicit bias in a variety of different industries. Certainly there's been studies and statistical analysis on this, and we've spoken on this in past symposiums. But it's certainly there in the legal profession. And I think, for a longtime practitioner at law firms, the practice of law has many opportunities for implicit bias to shine, right? If you think about all of the different hurdles that is required to not only get into a law firm or a company to practice law, but also to shine and get those opportunities in terms of getting on good work, on good cases, for good clients, and then doing that systemically over time to get the experience you need, and then ultimately get to a higher level of management and leadership in the firm. That's ripe for a lot of different areas of implicit bias to come into play. And we see that through a variety of different categories, right? There's the concept of microaggressions that, statistically people have shown in studies, but they're there in terms of, what we call death by 1,000 cuts, in terms of experiences that individuals of different classes, women, race, ethnicity, LGBT, experience while dealing with the day-to-day mundane of a law firm. And it's certainly there, and I think over time it adds up. And one of the things that they found regarding microaggressions is it leads to a loss of confidence, right? And a loss of confidence then impacts performance. And so there's this kind of cycle that happens where certain categories of implicit bias lead to other things like confirmation bias, right? Where individuals have preconceived notions of how people will perform, and when things happen that meet those notions, they become entrenched, and that's how implicit bias can further get strengthened, right? And also in terms of the bias that sometimes individuals have on themselves by sitting in areas where there is implicit bias, and the loss of confidence that can occur. And so, in a law firm, especially now in a competitive state like Illinois, where there's a lot of lawyers competing for a lot of jobs. Implicit bias is a real thing. And I would say, because this is an IP program, in the IP profession where, it's even more of a niche area within a law firm, with oftentimes high stakes fights that are happening, bet the company types of fights. We see that a lot in these types of cases. Implicit bias certainly can occur there as well. So, it's a real thing, and it's something that we're all trying to deal with in our organizations. And I think part of this panel is to, explore how we do that.
Right. And just in case there's people that maybe aren't familiar with some of these terms as well, you mentioned microaggressions, and would you mind giving just an example or sort of kind of a definition, just to make sure we're kind of all on the same page there?
Yeah, I mean, a microaggression can be something as simple as when you're in a boardroom of 5 or 6 individuals and you're talking about a case and a person. And I think a lot of us probably in this forum have experienced something like that, where you're offering your opinions and it's just not being received as in the same vein, or maybe the critiques are a little bit stronger than the norm. That can be an example of microaggressions. Sometimes when you submit work or getting the critiques that might be a little bit harsher than the norm. Those are a few examples that you might see. Sometimes getting passed up for a project. It might be a very small project, but just the mundane, routine, everyday type of situations that on their own probably don't sound like very much. But if you add them up, they do amount to a lot of issues. And there's been studies, I'll give you an example of studies that have happened where they've submitted to law firm partners blind essays where the essays are the same for control group A versus B. The only difference is that the partners are told what the race is of each individual. And statistically, even though they're the same essays with the same placed in mistakes, the individuals with the individual essay person that's associated as being a minority got a much lower score and a much higher critiques on that essay. So they've done statistical analysis for this type of stuff, and the biases are there. And getting those types of critiques and maybe than the norm, that's a microaggression, right? That's not sinking a person on day one of submitting that essay, but over time, it's a much more difficult place to work than the norm. And I think that's kind of where implicit bias likes to look at.
Yeah, someone, Lauren in the chat actually mentioned, she says, for women, the most common microaggression is assuming that you're not an attorney. So I think, some people see someone that isn't what they think an attorney should be, and then they just, and that's a little, like you said, like a little cut that it's going to get deeper and deeper. One thing I want to bring attention comes to IP practice specifically too. We, especially with patent prosecution, we have an additional, requirements for technical background. So now, we're dealing with S.T.E.M pipeline barriers that are, more rooted in general culture and occur, years before law school. So there's, added hindrance, that I think that's really what that statement to the USPTO kind of was talking about, just this, this additional barrier that contributes to some of the numbers that people are really kind of looking at, how should we look at those technical backgrounds? And it has been broadened over time, and I think we're going to see some change, there as well. But bring back to kind of the panel, with these issues in mind that, Daniel talked about, and with S.T.E.M pipeline issues, what have your firms or businesses, done? How do they filter these issues into recruiting and keeping, diversity in mind, and what kind of had to change to do so? Esther, if I could start with you, maybe we can kind of go around, whoever else wants to follow it after Esther. Well, I think you're muted, Esther. There we go.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for moderating, and thank you to all of the organizers who've made this possible, including Daryl Lennon. I'm very pleased to be joined by the co-panelists who bring different perspectives, both from private law firms as well as corporations. So I'll speak to the question from the perspective of a law firm. I think Daniel's point about implicit biases come in a lot of different ways, including the first step of determining who gets to join the organization. How we look at and assess candidates' likelihood of success and their potential traditionally have been defined by those who have been in positions of privilege and power and had leadership roles. And so those people have come from with a certain level of pedigree and resources and life experiences that are not reflective across the board of the future leaders in our profession that we would like represented today. So in my instance, I went to Maryland Law School. I'm a first generation lawyer. I'm an immigrant who've had to have multiple jobs throughout my life, starting in middle school and high school and college and law school. And it necessitated that I support myself through school, both at college and law school. And so it necessarily meant that I went to a state institution for tuition purposes. And in combination with scholarships, aid, and working, I was able to get a law degree for the first time in my family. So that does not afford the level of resources and background that might have landed me at an out-of-state school with certain level of ranking and prestige. My law firm at that time had never hired a person from Maryland Law School. They did not recruit at my school. They had plenty of great DC local schools from which to recruit. As well as nationally at some of the top institutions. Over time, that has evolved, and I'm no longer the only graduate from Maryland at my firm, very happy to say. I have other partners who've graduated from the same institution. I've been teaching at Howard Law School for the last 20 years. That's where I first met Idris, who's represented on the panel today. HBCUs have traditionally been overlooked in hiring, both at law firms and just generally. State institutions, community colleges for sure have been overlooked. And I spoke recently with a summer associate who just started last week at my firm. And he shared with me that he started at a community college, but he's reticent to even include that on his resume for the fear that he may be assessed differently during the recruiting process. And so the point of how do we measure the potential for success should be looked at critically in not only the pedigree that you have or the GPA or the name of the school, but rather the character and the potential and the life experiences, including demonstrated resiliency, creativity, and the ability to overcome obstacles thrown your way, all of which really come to bear when you look at the strength of our attorneys and who are able to navigate challenging circumstances, the ups and downs of practice, and dealing with clients' real world problems and being able to think creatively, working as a team. And all of those characteristics and attributes, I believe, have been traditionally under-assessed in the recruiting process as well as the evaluation process. So I think we can definitely do more in broadening our perspectives and casting the net wider.
Mm-hmm. And how we look at those, what are those metrics, and actually what are they really showing us? And I don't think it even really, it's not even something that is only for your first years either. I talked to a recruiter not that long ago. I think I mentioned this to some of you before, that was talking about they had were dealing with a client at a law firm, and they wanted somebody with 15 years experience and in this area, and they needed to be in the top 10 of their law school class. And it was like, well, if these last 15 years haven't, proved yourself, maybe that's maybe not the most important thing, but that was like the number 3 thing on their list of, 5 things that they wanted. And it really doesn't, it's not helping you find the best person there. It's just giving you fewer people to look at. And maybe that is part of the reason that it's been used to, is it's easier, but it doesn't necessarily make it better for you in the long run, right?
And I certainly agree with that point. And the amount of accumulated knowledge today is less an indicator of your success tomorrow than your willingness and ability to learn quickly and adapt to new situations. We're dealing with that right now with the pandemic, how we've had to all work differently and think creatively outside the box. Real world problems are stretching the limits of the law and technology in every way. And so the ability to work collaboratively in a team environment and thinking outside the box, those attributes I think are as important, if not more important, as we embrace the future.
And I just want to, ask this question to the, rest of the panel too, about, metrics specifically, and kind of what we're looking for, or what your company or what your firm, is now looking for. If anyone has any thoughts on that, or anything that they want to share, I just want to ask everyone before we, move on to the next.
Kyle, I'm glad to jump in, and Esther, good to see you again, and I'm glad to be on the panel. Good to see everybody here. So, and I should start off with my disclaimer that while I may talk about my company, much of what I will say will reflect my own opinions, so on and so forth, as opposed to being a representation of Estee Lauder companies. So, as far as metrics are concerned, I do think metrics are important. However, they probably need to be catered to your particular environment. So for my company, for example, our workforce is over 74% female, which is not typical in corporate America. However, you can still find disparities by level in terms of the distribution of male to female leadership in the organization. Certainly the same trends are true for minority representation across those levels. So what we look at is sort of benchmarking as best as we can, even though benchmarking is challenging because most companies are underperforming against most of these objectives. But it helps us to sort of level set and set immediate goals for where we want to look for numerical metrics, as sort of guideposts. Something that I did want to talk about a bit in terms of recruiting, though, is that there is a bit of a trap even within that. I don't want to be redundant of what Daniel mentioned in terms of implicit bias, but there's this trap around sort of confirmation bias in the recruiting process, where you will look for people who have different identities or different ethnic backgrounds, have different sort of attributes that are consistent with diversity, sort of outwardly, I guess. But we still are looking for conformity, because we talk about fit, for example. So you want to find someone who looks different but thinks the same as everyone else who's incumbent to the organization, which isn't the point in my opinion. And in fact, a lot of organizations, especially on the corporate side, have assessment tests. So they have personality profiles that they're looking for, which are inherently filters that are going to tear out of the system non-conforming mental models that might be additive in terms of a value proposition to your organization. So I think what's important when you're recruiting is to make yourself aware of your own mental models and your own, ability to be prone to this confirmation bias, and observe that when you're talking to a candidate that you probably are looking for answers to your question that conform to your own. That's the right answer because that's the way I would have answered it. So that's what I'm drawn to. And instead, try to pivot towards looking for additive perspectives. So does this person think differently? Is there a contrasting view on one or more of these issues that might add to the collective knowledge and capability of our organization? That's supposed to be the goal of diversity. It's not really about, frankly, bringing more Black people into an organization. It's that collectively we have a different experience that might lead to different ways of thinking that sort of enriches the entire community. So if we, for lack of a better word, whitewash that exercise by creating filters for personality traits that reflect what we already have internal to our organization, there really isn't a point to doing any of this. We have to be willing to kind of challenge convention in a lot of ways.
Right, and that those ideas of people saying, "Oh, doesn't seem like the right fit," is something that seems so kind of offhand, but really kind of just means I don't feel like I want to have a beer with them or go to coffee with them, and really doesn't have anything to do.
They're
with
not one of us. This is
It
essentially what you're saying.
has nothing really to do with what the performing the job too. And I think it sounds like something that is so innocuous, but actually when you kind of step back and think, well, what does that really mean? And I think that's kind of why some of these kind of broadening people to these issues and bringing this to the forefront is sort of some of these old hat things don't seem necessarily like pitfalls for this, but really it's it's rethinking a lot of how people have been doing things for so long, and putting in some of these policies in place to kind of hopefully correct or help see more people at least in the process. And actually that kind of leads into our next question, which I was going to...
Before we jump into the next question, Kyle, I'm sorry that I didn't want to lose sight of the metrics question in one regard, which is the number I don't think is necessarily as important as picking a number and measuring against it as sort of a formal process. If you just say in general, diversity is important to us, and that's a theme that you say is part of your mission, it'll get muddled and missed and you won't make any progress. But pick a number, whatever that number is, great. It should be a number better than wherever you are now, but you have to measure against it in really a formal process so that there's a reflection and accountability that's there. And I think that that's the most important piece of the metrics question.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, and we're going to our next question. So this the Daniel first. One thing I know that your firm has taken on is adopting the Mansfield Rule. So if you want to kind of talk a little bit, just explain what that is and how it's used. And I mean, that's not necessarily for initial recruiting, but typically is more on the high end of things, or the top end of folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Mansfield Rule, it's kind of a corporate spin-off of what in the NFL, the Rooney Rule, which required NFL teams to, whenever there was a new head coach position, they weren't required, of course, to hire a diverse person, but they had to consider a diverse candidate as part of their deck of candidates for the job. And that process, as small as that might sound, just consider, of course, led to the hiring of many an NFL coach that was diverse, including some legendary coaches, and that really helped diversify, I think, the coaching ranks in the NFL just by virtue of having that rule. Well, the Mansfield Rule is a spinoff of that for companies and law firms, and the way it works is for your organizational leadership structure. At our firm, that would be the executive committee and the participation committee. Executive committee sets the agenda for the firm, and the participation committee sets the compensation. The two most important committees for a law firm, right? Where's the direction and who's getting paid? The Mansfield Rule, at least as it operates to our firm, is that those positions are elected, but there has to be someone that is considered for any open positions where those occur. So actually, there's some positions that are appointed in addition to being elected. But the point of the matter is, once that mindset, that rule was adopted, and companies, law firms can certify that they're compliant with the Mansfield Rule, and many have. Once we did that, our executive committee, I'll just give you an example, switched from 10 out of 12 white males to 6 and 6 white males and 6 otherwise. And that's a huge change in 1 year. And so that's the type of, and from there, we've incrementally changed further than that. So, I'm opening up the book here just to show you the power of how that rule can really change your organization. And I give a lot of kudos to the leadership for going there and adopting that, and other firms have done that as well. And so, this is just an example from the top. Whenever we talk about diversity, DEI and changes at an organization, right? You're talking about the top, the middle, management, and the ground, right? But at a very basic level, it has to come from the top. If it doesn't come from the top, then the middle and the ground, you can't expect to do very much. And so the top, the Mansfield Rule is an example of that organizational prism and mindset where, you know, our leadership is going to make an effort to consider qualified candidates. And of course, at any organization, there's going to be qualified candidates. And so just by virtue of having that process, it opens things up a little bit. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, Kyle, we're also in the process of trying to be Mansfield Rule certified at Fitch Even. And I'm just going to echo what Daniel said about sort of this prism, if you will. And I think the Mansfield Rule at its essence is really talking about this layer with respect to what will happen at this layer. And it's about increasing, you know, it states itself, increasing the pool so that the leadership, so there can be increases in the diverse representation at the leadership level. So I think it's important to have all those layers in mind as we talk about diversity and equality and inclusion.
That's great. Kind of going back to our other issue that I brought up earlier, you know, do IP firms and companies have a responsibility to promote diverse STEM programs, you know, outside of law school, you know, before law school, because, you know, that is so important to, you know, the IP as a sector. You know, Esther, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm going to push that to you first as one of our patent attorneys.
Sure, I'd be happy to address that. I believe that in the collective, we all have a responsibility to promote diversity, and that cannot start early enough. When you open the panel with the statistics on how the legal profession is one of the least diverse, and moved on to even greater challenges within the IP profession, it demonstrates that the support and the encouragement and awareness of these professions need to start really early on. It's still very commonplace when I meet attorneys at my level or younger attorneys. How do they come to be a patent lawyer? Oftentimes it's by chance. It's by random connection to something that you might have heard from a professor, from a teacher, from a mentor along the way. Many of us who did not grow up with families of lawyers or generations of lawyers, it was very uncommon to even think about the possibility of going to law school, let alone being a patent attorney. So how I learned about the IP profession is when in undergrad, I was exploring graduate school options after majoring in computer science and mathematics. One of my professors that I was a TA for said, "Oh, you know, he was writing a recommendation letter for me for my application to law school. And he says, since you're interested in law school, you should look into intellectual property. You have a good background for that." And I had no idea what he was talking about. This is the first time I heard the words intellectual property, but I sort of tagged it in the back of my mind. And then when I could start taking electives in law school, I took patent law, copyrights, and that's how my interest in IP flourished. That's not an uncommon story for a lot of the people in the IP profession. And so one of the things that as a firm we're trying to do is not just encouraging diverse students to go into the study of law, but in order to promote greater representation of diversity in the IP profession, we have to start much earlier. It's not enough to speak to college students who already have declared majors or well on their way to getting a degree to start talking about patent law, because they might not even be pursuing STEM. And so it starts much earlier, when we talk about the double barrier to entry, not only just to law, but also to IP which requires oftentimes a STEM background, you have to start in high school. You have to start in middle school. I go talk to elementary school kids through certain programs and talk about how I work with inventors and help companies with innovative ideas. And when I went to speak to a classroom of fifth graders several years ago, one of those students who never heard about a patent attorney went home and told her mother she wants to be a patent attorney. And I later heard from that mom, oh my gosh, you inspired my daughter to be a patent attorney. Our law firm hosted several years ago, in collaboration with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, a Saturday Girl Scout IP patch program to introduce inner city District of Columbia girls and boys about the world of IP. And we had stations set up for a simple invention. They could design a trademark for their product, and they could have their 1-page, 2-page application reviewed and stamped with approval from the PTO representative who was on site. They had a blast. And for some of them, it was the first time that they ever thought about the possibility of pursuing science and technology, that inventions can be cool, and seeing women and diverse attorneys speaking at the program who kind of look like them, and thought, this is a possibility for me. And so, to me, it's never too early to expose students about the possibility of STEM, and then also moving on from there, having an IP career as a technical specialist or a patent agent. You don't even need to go to law school. And so in that connection, our law firm just launched a brand new program that we're very proud of called Finnegan IP University. And it was designed to reach out to undergraduate and graduate STEM students across the country and actually worldwide. We had applicants from over 6 countries. And we had so many applications that we ended up accepting over 80 for a 5-week virtual course once a week, where they got to learn about the different areas of IP and meet with IP practitioners in patents and in trademarks. And many of the students have said that that was their first exposure to the possibility of working in IP. Even though they were already in STEM, they never heard about it. Mm-hmm. And so we recognize that it's an ongoing issue, it's an ongoing challenge to get out there early enough for students to have a meaningful opportunity to get into the profession. And so I think programs like that and others are really critical in a collective effort to increase diversity in the profession.
Mm-hmm. And just that knowledge base of this is something that you can actually do. I mean, even when I had friends in law school that had been chemists and things like that, and I can think of 2 or 3 really that said, one day I just realized I didn't want to be in a lab every day, and it wasn't something I liked. And it wasn't until then that I started looking about what other opportunities, and they had already were professional in their field. It wasn't, and that was the first time that, after they had, been working in as a chemist, realized that, there's this other path I could have taken, and maybe I wish I would have taken it earlier. And so, I think that knowledge base of sort of how finding out how some of these wheels are working in the background isn't always something that we let people know. So shining a spotlight on that makes a lot of sense. Does anybody else know of any other kind of programs that are related to early STEM outreach for younger diverse students or things like that?
I don't have a lot of detail that I could probably share in this panel, but I have been approached by, and I've been helping to kind of promote a program that's sponsored by the Harity Law Firm, where they're specifically helping with pipeline towards careers in patent law, but starting early on in undergraduate education to both support and mentor potential diverse students, and then also to fund the patent bar for them and help them to find internships. So they're making a lot of progress towards, helping towards this objective of access, I should say, to the profession. Starting with, as Esther mentioned, awareness. I was one of those students who was steered towards patents by a research mentor when I was a chemistry student. I had not heard of a patent prior to that, except in passing on products that might have been on a shelf. So if it hadn't been for that happenstance, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Leith, I wanted to point a question to you on the, on the in-house side of things. How is recruitment different where you are, which I know is, more of a startup, and sort of how do you keep those issues, these issues in mind where you are?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kyle. And thanks for having me, of course. Recruitment is quite important to us. And I feel like a good segue into this conversation is a bit more on the IP and youth. So apologies for answering an earlier question here.
Sure.
Like Esther and Idris, myself, didn't know what a patent was. First generation American, moved here from Jordan, was an engineer through and through, worked in a lab, thrombin loading, molecular imprinted polymers. My game was being in a lab coat. Big trials, cheap trials, you name it. A couple of my friends and I, during undergrad and grad school, founded a company that ended up going out of business because of IP problems. Asked around, one of our investors kind of sort of pulled the rug out from under us, didn't understand why, didn't understand how. Asked around, turns out IP is this big thing that's really interesting. Went to law school. Now, growing my company to close to a $500 million valuation. We have 25 patents. Nobody's pulling out the rug from under us now, right? And we sort of did this for this reason. How we do that is through recruiting, right? And as Idris was saying earlier, you really have to measure what matters. And for us, from day one, been with this company since we were 2 people, and we're about 65 now, has been for us to measure the effect of different team dynamics, whether that's generational, whether that's ethnicities, whether that's diversity of backgrounds when it comes to education, whether that's gender or anything like that. And so on our end, on the recruiting front, what we've tried to do is have sort of DEI leaders all across the board. And so every single person in our company who becomes a hiring manager must consider diversity from their perspective. Doing so allows us to be, we're a chemical engineering company, right? And so we're in a technology company that is majority minority. We have majority women in our company, which is not easy to do in this industry. And we've only done it by empowering each of our hiring managers to be their own DEI officer and DEI head. And so putting that importance on every single person, having them understand that diversity thought is very important, understanding what to look at when it comes to resumes and internships and things, as Esther was mentioning. We do look at community colleges. We do look at, folks that didn't have internships but worked through college and put themselves through, and we value that. We don't ask for GPAs necessarily. We don't ask for certain things that potentially some others do, and allows us to just have a bigger pie. And prior to us making any offer, the first question any hiring manager is, what is the makeup of your recruiting pool? And if the recruiting pool itself is 80% male, we go back. Not a single interview is given. We go back. Something is wrong with our job description. Something is wrong with our recruiting pool. Something is wrong with our, talent pipeline, and we go back and adjust. And so we try our best to ensure a eye towards diversity, not only from the top, but also from every single person who's expanding their team company-wide.
That's really interesting. And the idea too that this is who applied. I think that's an easy way that a lot of people are kind of, there's a cop out of like, well, this is who we saw. This is who wanted to see us. So there's nothing else that we can be doing, opposed to, where are you posting? How are you looking at actually? Where are you actually doing recruitment efforts and things like that? Re-looking at sort of the internal opposed to just what's coming at you as it must just be the norm is a really interesting issue. Kind of related to that, I wanted to ask you too, Leith, was as a small company, you're also dealing with outside counsel quite a bit, and bringing them on. And we talked a little bit the other day about sort of hearing those pitches and sort of what you look for on the in-house side from a firm trying to get your business, and sort of what are you seeing in those pitches towards diversity and how that's being displayed to you as a consumer on the other side of the firm life.
Sure. Yeah. When I was at a firm, we always heard of, companies asking more and more for diversity. In some of the pitches that were on, those questions weren't really asked, to be honest with you. We make sure now as a company that we do ask those questions on diversity, so that, folks at firms have more firepower on their end to say, we're not going to get hired because my staff is 4 white males. Right. And so we try our best to make sure that we're that voice in the room. We do ask for diversity statements from each and every one of our firms. We have a questionnaire that folks fill out. We don't only ask for diversity, we ask for values, which we think are sort of lend themselves to, a root sort of problem. And so on our end, whether we're looking for, IP litigation staff, whether we're looking for corporate attorneys, whatever we're looking for, we always must have a slide in a pitch deck about their pro bono efforts every single time. And we have hired 0 attorneys that have had no pro bono in their practice, 0. And many have pitched, and many have said, what do you mean I have to go back and put this together? And it's like, well, sorry about it. We're only going to be hiring folks that, share the same values as we do. And we've been successful, and we work with, the biggest firms between, Finnegan, Cooley, Kirkland, et cetera. And the partners that we work with at those firms have been selected by us, right? And so speaking very kindly of any of these firms, there's going to be some folks at those firms that we don't want to work with, but there's folks at those firms that we do want to work with, right? And so we try to not paint with a broad brush and say, firm X is not good for diversity. Rather, we say, I will be giving my work to this person who I know values diversity, who I know values pro bono, who I know values mentorship and support for underprivileged students at the middle school level, right? And so that's how we like to try to influence from our end.
And can you really? I mean, I'm sure you can probably have examples that you probably would be able to give us specific examples, but the pitches or the firms or situations where you could really kind of sniff out that they were just checking a box and not. I'm sure that you can kind of tell right away, right? It's not just something that you can just fake, right?
Absolutely. One of our pitches that I talk about very, very fondly with Davis Wright Tremaine, I'll name them specifically. They sent 3 women associates to pitch us. And the partner was on the phone and said to me, I hope you don't think that this means that I will give you less attention. This doesn't show your importance to our firm, et cetera, but you're going to be working with these 3 people. You're working with the associates, not me. I'm probably reviewing some work here and there. And she's right. And the 3 associates came in, pitched excellently, and they've been our attorneys for the past 2 years. And doing that, it's sort of like proof in the pudding, right? And so empowering youth that may have not gotten that opportunity in other firms or elsewhere, that's a team that I want to align with. And so seeing those sort of tactics from different firms and how to, show their prospective clients on how they're impacting diversity is something that we're always looking forward to seeing.
That's great.
I'd just like to give a shout out to what Leith said and their approach to hiring outside counsel, because not only does that have direct impact on the diversity of the team that's working with Leith for that project or for that engagement, but it has a positive ripple effect, and that is it gives those diverse attorneys on that team greater leverage and greater voice at the firm as they get selected and they have direct contact and relationship with clients, which then enables them to promote diversity in the teams that they will manage in the future. And that standing really allows for greater advocacy. And I think clients, may underestimate the power and the influence that they provide when they make that intentional engagement and asking for responsible attorneys to be those diverse attorneys and not just on the team to improve the metrics superficially, and looking beyond that and providing that feedback and communicating that to law firms. It's a huge game changer.
Yeah, I think Esther and Laith have just said probably the single mouthful that I wanted to cover off on if I got a question directed at me, and that is that clients have so much ability to drive diversity and equality and inclusion forward. And if you are responsible for giving your organization's work to law firms, stop thinking about law firms and start thinking about lawyers. And if you value diversity, start insisting on talking with lawyers who represent traditionally underrepresented groups. And as you talk about the possibility of that lawyer and his or her law firm representing you, insist that the conversation be led by that lawyer who's from an underrepresented group. Insist that your work be managed by that lawyer who's a member of an underrepresented group. And what Esther has said is something that sometimes people who've spent their entire career in-house don't understand, but it is that ability to develop business and bring business into a firm that changes the voices around the table and enables that lawyer from a traditionally underrepresented group to be at the table and to be heard in full voice at the table.
Mm-hmm. And really giving them, I think this is actually a nice transition to our next section about retention, because you're really giving them an actual opportunity. They're not just there as like someone mentioned the other day, as like window dressing or tokenism, just because we feel like we have to have that because clients say they want this. Like to really involving them where they have ownership. And I think that's a key thing that we're gonna get into when we look at retention, because recruiting is only a fraction of what you need to create your workforce. Because if you don't have people staying, then obviously something's not right. I want to mention one study showed that in major law firms, about half of lawyers of color leave within 3 years, and for women of color, about 75% depart by their 5th year, and 85% before their 7th. So, I think this question is really into retention, is sort of what are these issues, some of these issues that are being directed, or these issues that are specific to, diverse attorneys and what they face, and, making them not want to continue at these firms. And I think, we've mentioned some of these before, but about microaggressions and things like that. But where is our problem with retention once you obtain people, do you think? That can be for kind of anybody who has thoughts on that first.
Well, this is a topic that I think about constantly in my role as not just partner now, but also Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. But it's a topic that's plagued the legal profession for decades. It's not a new problem. I think we are facing the compounding of that issue with the pandemic and going hybrid and virtual. We hear it with the Great Resignation, right? Women leaving the profession and losing all the gains that we've worked so hard for in the past several decades. Attrition comes in, I think, 2 different forms. One is by an active choice of the attorney to have alternative paths that they would like to seek. It's a choice. Another is because it's just not working out. For whatever reason, you just can't make it, you can't hang on. And I think those challenges and those difficulties that confront people who eventually leave, sometimes they're avoidable. You know, I think for example, for me, one of the key things to make sure that someone is on the right track to have a shot at success, equal shot at success means that you have a good project waiting on your desk when you start. Law firms tend to be very free market, especially in a culture where you have a collaborative work environment, so it's not rigid and structured. So how you get work may be very fluid. You can get it across departments, across many people, different clients. And in those environments, how people get their first opportunity may depend on who you worked with when you were a summer. But some people don't have that experience, don't have those relationships, even if you did work as a summer, especially you work virtually during your summer, you know, in the last 2 years. That's a very different experience than if you were spending the whole summer having basically lunches every day and, you know, happy hours on a consistent basis and being in somebody's office. And being able to talk about common life experiences, whether it's golf or tennis or, you know, hiking, whatever hobby. I mean, when I was starting out, our all attorney retreats were called golf and tennis outing. And I was left wondering in my own office, well, where do I fit in? Never picked up a racket or a golf club. So, of course I don't. But, you know, those first opportunities really set the course for your next project, then the next. And if you don't succeed in the first year, it's really hard to right the ship in the second year because you're already behind on work experience, the writing skill sets or the legal analysis. Then compared to your peers who got on a prime litigation project from day one because, you know, they hit it off with the partner who's responsible the summer before. And so, you know, when we talk about retention, I believe that really the two key ingredients of success, especially early on when you start, critical ingredients, good projects and good mentors. And if you don't have either, then you've got an uphill battle. And I think that in turn leads to the retention impact, of course, then later on for advancement and promotion. But I think it really starts early on.
And this is actually tying us to the panel before us. You know, they were talking about quite a bit about retention and mentoring specifically through their lens. You know, how do we create effective mentoring programs for, I mean, all attorneys, but specifically in mind for, you know, diverse attorneys? And, you know, so, or maybe a better question is, or what are the efforts that, you know, your businesses and firms are doing to try to create some of those relationships, at least at you know, that at start level?
Yeah, if I could just echo what Esther said, which I thought was excellent, on the issue of the need for mentorship and how crucial it is at those early moments for an attorney. At our firm, and I think at many firms, right? No one really walks into a firm on year one as Clarence Darrow, right? They have to evolve to that place, right? And it's a long road from, you know, green attorney to person who sits in a partner office and brings in clients and is part of the vehicle for the firm's success. And I like to think of it, you know, for the associates as kind of 3 phases, right? You have phase 1, where the associates are really learning their craft, and especially also the IP associates, right? Because there's a lot of technical information to learn and a lot of, you know, nuanced areas of the law that you have to master, right? And that takes some time to do that, right? The learning of the X's and O's, right? And then you enter that middle phase where you're able to, as an associate, take on larger projects, maybe have some localized leadership on a case, maybe handle a small case on your own with some supervision, but some client interaction on certain bases. But you're still in a managed state as you are also escalating in your responsibility, right? And then into the senior role, which is where you're really being groomed to get across the partner threshold, where you're doing more interface with the client. You can handle things on your own, and you're getting to a place where we like to say is our threshold for becoming partner. We always have to answer this question, yes. There's other questions to ask, but you have to answer this question, yes. Can you do a case on your own unsupervised? If the answer is no, you don't get to walk the tightrope on the circus, right? Because there's no net as a partner, underneath you when you're handling a case. You are it. You're the final say on how this case is going to be handled. And so the evolution of an associate to get from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to partnership, right? Well, that doesn't happen on its own. Partners and mentors have to really understand the dynamics of each stage, have realistic expectations as to what people can or cannot do, and help them evolve. And so in stage 1, is the partner or mentor walking through and taking the time to take a project and say, okay, I'm going to take some time out of my day and walk you through how you did it, and maybe some feedback on how to do it the next time. And let's kind of get a little granular, just for constructive criticism and to give you some tips. Well, that takes time. That takes effort. That's where mentoring comes in, right? For stage 2, right? Are you going to give advice on how to interact with the clients, how to take some responsibility, manage a file, and maybe think more strategically, less task-based and more strategic on a case, right? Junior attorneys usually look at the task in front of them. As you get along the road, you start looking at things more strategically, right? Stage 3, understanding what it means to manage a team, to be able to handle a case on your own, to interface with the client and manage those client relationships. And then ultimately to partner, what it means to not only do the work, but also put food on the table for the firm, right? Because that's one of the goals for partnership. So through that entire process, who are the mentors that are walking you through and giving you that guidance to do that? And I found that where people have that guidance and mentorship on a granular level, and it really requires some elbow grease by the mentors, you then see people succeed and rise to the top. And when you don't have that, people fall away. They feel isolated. They feel like they can't understand what is expected, and they can't meet expectations because they haven't been groomed to meet those expectations. And so, our firm, we have a mentorship program. Every associate is assigned a mentor. That's a real mentor who sits in the room during evaluation time, pretty much an advocate for that person. It's a person who's always has the door open for the associate to talk about pretty much anything. We also have the option for diverse attorneys to have, upon their selection, a diversity mentor who's another attorney who to set up a framework where maybe the associate can talk about things that they may not feel comfortable talking with the regular mentor. So what we call layers and channels of help and assistance, right? And then we have certainly a back office of many different people. A lot of them are not attorneys as well, to help with associates and give them the resources they need. Mental health, a lot of different services. And so I think that's where it's helpful. That's, when we talked about the high level of the pyramid, this is the low end of the pyramid. This is the granular level. And this is really important to get people from A to B to C to D. And if you don't do that, Kyle, as you said, the statistics show people will fall. They will drop away. And then you're going to have to invest again in the recruiting and do it all over again. So a real retention model, it's a lot of effort. It requires a lot of gauging and modifying. But it's really important to get people to where they need to go, because if you can't get them to a certain place, then people like Idris and Laith can't hire people, right? We're not going to get hired if they're not equipped to handle that call without the partner, right? To be on that call and be groomed enough to handle all the issues and questions, and at the same time represent the diversity component. So a little bit on that.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any other kind of thoughts about or examples of sort of how mentoring where they are or places they've been in the past?
I have a lot of thoughts. So One of the things that I'd say, and maybe this is an opportunity to bring in some of the questions that are coming in through the Q&A. I don't want to steal your role as moderator, Kyle, but I think one of the things that's important to take into account is really broader social dynamics that are at play. So the Washington Post a couple of years ago, I think 2014, 2015, did a study where they showed that about 3/4 of white people don't have any non-white friends, and the average white person might have one black friend. So when that's sort of your norm, it creates an insider-outsider dynamic. And in corporations and law firms as well, the incumbent there has always been white males, essentially. So that means that for me to be successful, what I've always learned and appreciated is that I have to make white males comfortable with me. That's frankly how it is. And the reverse is not true. So for a white male to be successful professionally, they don't have to make me comfortable. That's just the reality of the situation. Now, what's good about it is I'm a people person. So I've been able to sort of code switch and bridge those gaps and build trusted relationships. To Esther's point, I also have an upbringing that facilitated a lot of that. So I used to race giant slalom, which is shocking for a black male to have done. I was a soccer player. I went to a Catholic prep school, but I also went to Howard University for undergrad and for law school. So I've lived in both of those worlds, but for those who know me professionally, they're kind of surprised by some of what happened in my background in terms of what my upbringing and kind of where I came from. But again, it comes down to sort of this extra energy that comes into navigating those spaces and knowing where I am and knowing what face to put on in certain environments. And in order to do that, it's pretty effortless at this point. It's kind of like putting on my jacket when I walk out the door. But that's sort of the cognitive load that minorities and women for years and years and years have sort of trudged through. And made a part of their daily work, is that this is what I do to navigate these spaces, to build these trusted relationships, to sort of break through some of those barriers that are there. And a lot of them are, to use Daniel's language, it's unconscious. People are just used to the environment they're in. They live in, I should say we all live in very homogeneous communities. Our neighbors look a lot like us. Our social circles look a lot like us. And when something deviates from that norm, there's inherent resistance. It just feels like change. So you start to put up your antenna and think of things differently, consciously or unconsciously, whether it might be through microaggressions or just questions that you want to ask, or just lack of feeling like your norm, because these aren't the people that you go to church with and see, in all of your social interactions. So you feel that there's resistance in that relationship. So those barriers, I think, are what's important. So when we talk about mentorship, I think someone in your last panel, I can't remember his name, but I liked what he said was that he didn't like the word mentor. I don't know that I don't like the word mentor, but I think what's more important is that relationships are really at the heart of it. It's, whether you think you have a mentor or not, or a sponsor or not, being able to build trusted relationships, particularly as a lawyer, is critical. It's really, really important. And having those social barriers that are in place because you're different from the group that's essentially in power creates sort of an extra hurdle that you have to kind of climb over to be able to make those connections and to facilitate that trust. So part of what we're doing is just kind of putting in a little bit of extra effort to say, well, we're also people like you. So, my kids are going to school, they're having these issues. I like skiing too, and this is what it's like on the East Coast versus what it's like in Colorado. I'm jealous of you guys who are out in the mountain country. We ski on ice, but it's also practical. So the fact that I can help to bridge those gaps by talking about something that's common, frankly, socioeconomically, like skiing between us, that's the bridge that bridges that gap. If I were to talk to them about my undergraduate experience at Howard University and, Notorious B.I.G. on stage on, campus at Yardfest, that might be a block because that might be a different experience that I had in undergrad versus what we can talk about in terms of ski trips. Or the fact that my family just came back from Europe and we went to Barcelona and we got to go to the, Sacred Court, the Sagrada Familia, so on and so forth. So we have to kind of account for these sort of lifestyle activities in a way that requires a certain amount of deliberation. You have to be deliberate about having these experiences so that you can create social connections in a thoughtful way when you're essentially an outsider. Now, I did want to get to the Q&A, and I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent. I'm prone to that. I apologize. But this question about whether certain types of diversity are more important than others. This, again, is where I think it's important to take a step back and look at how we're trying to address diversity and inclusion and equity as companies and as law firms, as opposed to looking at broader social truths, I think. So if you go back to the suffrage movement, for example, for women's rights, Black people weren't a part of that. It was about women, but not Black women. If you look at civil rights in the 1960s, it was about largely Black men making progress towards equal rights. And there was a bit of sexism that was involved. Certainly it was not about equal rights when it came to LGBTQ plus issues. Black churches have struggled even to recent times to be able to get their hands wrapped around that. So equity within the equity movement is imbalanced. That's always been true. And I think when you appreciate that that's where we've been throughout history, going all the way back to Patrick Henry in 1775, when he said, "Give me liberty or give me death," he had slaves. So the irony is from the founding of our country. But that doesn't mean that equity isn't still the mutual objective across all of those groups. How we go about it is something that I think we're all trying to figure out. So the way that I've described this in my circles and in my company is right now in the arc of history towards equity and professionalism, we're at a place of entropy where there's a lot of activity, but we haven't been able to focus our energy in a particular goal that I think we're all aligned around trying to deliver against. We just know that we want to get right. We want to do better in this kind of nebulous way. And there are a lot of panel discussions. There are discussions like this one that we're having to try to get the conversation started. But I also think it's important that people who frame their questions by saying this might be a silly question, or I hope not to make offense, that we give them a certain amount of room and grace. The idea that cancel culture, I know it's politicized these days, sort of clouds and muddles that discussion, I think is also a problem, because there are people who have come from different experiences. They might be very religious people who are struggling to deal with, what we think is a sense of equity in a more progressive way. And by vilifying them, you shut down their ability to grow. And most of the progress that I've made throughout my life has been through making mistakes. So I make mistakes, I make errors in judgment, errors in personal relationships, so on and so forth. And it grows me as a person, it grows my capability, my perspective on life, and my ability to be a better person. So if every time someone falls down and makes a mistake, we essentially cancel them and say, this is a bad person, this person can't, they're untouchable now. That, is isolated with respect to that individual who we more or less cancel. But I'm more worried about the ripple effects, which is how many people can we help to make progress against in terms of the way that they think, to drive mutual understanding, to drive connection, more inclusion, more equity, where they're now shut down because they're afraid to say something. They're afraid to even ask a question that might be received in a way that provokes offense. So, giving people the benefit of the doubt to ask questions that they're nervous to ask, and then not assuming that it's because they're a terrible, person who doesn't believe in justice and equity, but instead maybe their own ignorance or their lack of experience, or because they're one of many Americans who doesn't have a friend who doesn't look and think like they do. That is where I think we should all look for opportunity to build these bridges and make progress. So,
and I think we were talking about in your firm or your business, you're building a culture through your policies. And yes, I think there is an importance to celebrating differences and having sort of these moments to celebrate Pride Month or celebrate specific groups at your firm. But also, it's really about kind of how changing your actual culture of your business is going to be through these policies, like creating these mentor programs, parental leave, flexible work hours. These are sort of things that we think about building a policy, a culture to create. And one thing I did kind of want to mention, though, is that I think we don't always think about, often we think about these DEI policies as sort of like, oh, these are things that you can do and check them off, and that's going to be helping things. But actually, sometimes these can work in conflict. And building off actually a lot of what the first panel was talking about, I wanted to address this to the group as one example of this conflict is we have, these new hybrid working environments with, people working in and out of the office or having more flexible times, flexible schedules, and especially it's going to help your senior role people with, especially those with families, and often women have the brunt in our culture of the family obligations, and obviously we want to, part of these efforts is to build up women, but now that we have these hybrid situations, there's some worry about the your first year, your first young attorneys kind of getting left behind, and if anyone's going to get extra left behind, if that's a term, would be your people from diverse backgrounds, and creating more isolation, even though maybe some young people really are seeking out these more remote opportunities. And so one thing I kind of wanted to ask to everybody was, what's being done at your workplace in terms of, how do we create hybrid policies, promote and support, our senior women, and then also our young attorneys from diverse backgrounds. How are you seeing to balance that, or how are those discussions happening? Because it's really an issue that's happening sort of in real time right now.
Again, I have thoughts, but I want to defer to someone else since I just took up the last segment.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of piggyback off a lot of us, you need multiple layers, right? you need the top, the middle, and the bottom in terms of strategy, and you need, I think, opportunities for people to break bread together. I think, piggybacking off of Idris's comments, a lot of this is not just about statistics. In fact, the statistics, many organizations have the statistics, and yet there's still a problem, right? I think it's more, as the conversation on diversity is going more and more, is to the humanity of the situation, right? The individualism of people, right? And understanding and appreciating and letting people have their individualism come out and their humanity come out. And so how do you do that? Getting people to feel comfortable to not feel like there is a mold and there is a culture and there's a quote unquote fit. I remember those words being used early in my career in terms of recruiting as well. So I forget who said that, but that was right on point. But you're actually welcome to be yourself, right? And that's really important, I think, for diverse people, right? To be themselves and not have to cater to the mold. And at the same time, those individuals have to understand that they're working with people that historically are being asked to change, right? And so there's a whole dynamic that's happening. And how do you make that dynamic work? Have to get people out of their offices, and definitely in the remote age, get people out of their remote offices and break bread together. That doesn't mean that I'm advocating for everybody to come back to the office. Quite the opposite. I'm working remotely right now and giving this remotely. But the point of the matter is, I think you need systematic, consistent breaking of bread with individuals to get that humanity going, and to understand that you're really trying to get people to appreciate each other and get to know each other, make real relationships, because that's what's going to organically lead to the mentoring and the valuing and more of a family culture. And so that's something that we try to do is have those types of opportunities. And I like to tell the young attorneys too. I say, you want to know what it's like to get business? You have to find common ground with people. You have to be very good at what you do. You have to listen, and you have to find common ground so that way people can relate to you and understand from a perspective. And so that dynamic, I think, is very crucial. And you can't do it remotely from your computers, and you can't do it just from your offices with no common interaction. So that's kind of the glue that I think helps, in addition to the other programmatic aspects of diversity.
So something that I do want to add is that hybrid is still something that I think everybody's figuring out. But another opportunity, I think, for lawyers and legal departments is to recognize our own incompetence when it comes to management, and that management is its own discipline. And I mean people management in particular. I think culturally, what I've observed is that lawyers have always taken pride in like the informal nature of paying your dues and navigating the system and dealing with the inefficiencies in the way that we develop people, which is without sufficient intention in most cases. Now, there are pockets where that is not true, and there are more structured training approaches when it comes to dealing with new associates and new attorneys. But people development, especially now, I think is becoming more and more important, and it's something that talent is looking for and demanding. And it's in the interest of employers to pivot and look at your own structured training programs and development programs and the ways that you create opportunities for growth across your organization, whether people are hybrid or remote or full on in office. It's something that you want to be able to drive accountability around, and also appreciate that it's not something that people are always going to do on their own volition. So something that I hear sometimes when we talk about this idea of people management is that you're a manager, so obviously you're responsible for your people. But a level beyond that, the managers of people need to hold all of their people accountable for people development, if that makes sense. Because if you're not assessing that, you're going to assume that it's happening. And it's not, is a reality, at least not universally.
How do you go about assessing or measuring the success in DEI at a company? Like how do you look at those items and say what we're doing is working, or this is where we need to do more work? How do we measure these things, or how can we?
Right. So I think recruiting, we've sort of talked about a bit, but also on the management side. So again, bring in more structures in terms of how you manage the kind of work that people are getting, the kinds of client interactions, if you're at a firm, that associates are getting on your team. And I think being able to visualize that data and then aggregate it across your organization, I think is important. So for example, if you can measure the number of engagements where a minority or female, or however you're defining diversity in your organization, how a diverse person has been able to engage with a client on this kind of matter of X or Y value, and then just display it. I think being able to measure it and sort of surface that information and make it transparent across an organization will start to show where there are outliers, because there are going to be certain partners or certain managers in an organization where conspicuously the women or minorities or whoever are in those target groups may or may not be making the same strides as a lot of their peers. And that might lead to further questions. Are there performance issues, so on and so forth? Maybe, maybe not. But if you start to see this distribution and there's some consistencies that you see over time with certain individuals, then there starts to become evidence of a through line of a certain problem in your managerial ranks. That there's someone who, again, consciously or unconsciously, I'm not going to say that this person has malintent, but you can even surface to them. Maybe it's something that they didn't realize just based on the relationships that they have. Maybe it is because they have proximity bias and now we're hybrid, so the people that they see every day are the ones who are getting certain kinds of work and not the people who are remote. It could be anything. But helping the organization to be able to measure that information, I think, can take us a long way, just because it makes you aware.
Yeah. As we kind of close out this retention section, and we only have a few more minutes, actually, I wanted to address Karen's question from the Q&A. And anyone who has thoughts on this, please go ahead. Do you see any improvement or expanding of on-ramping of attorneys who left the field due to microaggression or family obligation? Example, child rearing or taking care of ill parents. Anyone have any thoughts about the returning of those folks, or any thoughts on this question?
I'll speak very briefly because I've been chatty. So for one, I don't always know why people have left when I'm recruiting for a role, so it's hard to tell. Sometimes you can glean some of that from your resume and it might come up during the interview. I think what's important is to not be biased against that, and maybe to be overt. The way that we work in terms of recruiting is we work through sort of a talent person will be assigned to source candidates for a role. I think those interactions are really important, that, finding people who might have non-conventional backgrounds or may have taken a break and that, they're coming back into the workforce, that should not be something that you rule out for sure. And if they have, great experiences otherwise or credentials, but they have, you know, a period where there's a gap in their resume, that's not something you should be screening out. In fact, it might be an opportunity. So I think it's important to do that. But we're evolving all of that, because on a recent DE&I panel, one of our employees mentioned that it would be good for us to start blinding resumes where we don't have the names of the individuals listed, and I thought that was a great idea. And I've heard it before, but maybe just not at work. So we're always trying to make progress to bring more equity and objectivity into the initial screening process. I think there's still some opportunities to make progress when you actually have those interactions at the interview stage, because all of your unconscious biases are kind of at play, and it becomes more about self-awareness.
And I think those unconscious biases are not just in the recruiting stage, but also as you evaluate performance. I know we talked about studies that have shown that people grade lower when they know it's a woman or a person of color for the same writing. And so evaluation, I think, is a key factor in determining someone's success, and how we measure and train people who give evaluation to be cognizant of some of the implicit biases that may play in, and how you have procedures that guard against those and equalize comparison of performance among different attorneys throughout their career. I think is really a critical a part of looking at retention. I actually want to amplify a couple of the points that Idris raised earlier in addressing diversity within diversity issue. I really believe that there is so much that can be done through allyship among different demographics. It's not about who gets the bigger share of the pie among the unrepresented groups, but rather it should be a conversation about how we grow the pie, because it's not enough. Underrepresented groups have been not part of the process and in positions of influence in the legal profession for many, many years. And more can be done by working together rather than having division among different diverse groups. Another point that I would like to amplify that Idris raised was the challenge that people feel when you have uncommon lived experiences, and how Idris has to straddle between two different worlds of talking white and talking black. You know, I spoke to one of my white male mentors who had a distinguished career at an AMLO 100 firm for 3 decades. And then he would work in an environment in DC public schools where he was one of the only white males in the room. And when that experience hit him as a very well-established lawyer and a professional, he realized for the first time why people are driven to code switch. And he never experienced for himself what it's like to be the one of only. And so I would encourage everyone participating in this conversation today and at the summit, when you think about diversity issues, put yourself in situations where you are only one of, and feel what that, experience what that feels like. I've had a white male partner who comes to speak at the Howard IP and Social Justice Conference. And at the luncheon where we talk about IP and social justice issues, he was one of the only white person there. And I could tell that he was visibly uncomfortable. And so I took that opportunity to talk about that. And I said, this is what it feels like to be one of only. Your life experience has never forced you to be in that circumstance. So I think it really helps to promote greater understanding when you go through those experiences yourself.
That's great. I think we're out of time. We didn't quite get to all our topics I wanted to get to, but I think we had a fantastic discussion. Appreciate everybody taking the time out of their days to come in And thanks again to Professor Lim and Adam for having myself and all of us.
I think I can echo what Kyle said, and thank you all for a wonderful discussion. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to clear off the stage. So there's that. And we will invite Gary Friedlander back, and we are going to invite Professor Daryl Lim back up to the stage to provide the closing remarks.
Well,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, greetings from Zurich. I apologize for the lighting. I'm in a bunker in an undisclosed location. No, I'm here for a conference. And like many of you, I'm so glad for the flexibility of being able to work remotely. This is something that came up in both sessions. I want to thank Adam, Kyle, and the panelists. Adam has assembled a wonderful team of experts to address some of the most important issues of practice under the broad umbrella of mental health and wellness, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. I hope that all of us learn something that we can use personally to better our lives and the lives of those around us. I also want to thank Gary for his very kind introduction. As Adam mentioned, Gary will be taking over from me, in fact, 3 weeks from today. And he comes to us with over 2 decades of experience as a leader in IP, in tech, and in privacy at TransUnion. But not only that, he is an alumnus of the law school. And I hope you will join me in cheering him on as he leads our program in the next chapter. So this will be my last IP Center event as director, but I will return with Gary and Adam in August for a joint program with the World IP Organization and with the IP Office of Singapore on IP and dispute resolution. So with that, thanks everyone and have a good weekend. And Gary and Adam, over to you.
Daryl, I'll echo your comments. The discussion was phenomenal. In fact, I was writing notes and I've got multiple pages of notes that I need to run through just for my my personal education. Many of the comments hit home for me over my my very long career. In fact, Esther's last comment about having that experience where you're the only one in the room, I actually had that experience, and I do recommend it. But it is hard to describe to people what that is like unless they experience it themselves. So with that, I want to thank the panelists. The discussion was, again, just incredible. And I hope everybody who attended got something out of it. And I thank everybody for attending on a Friday afternoon. Adam, back over to you.